It's autumn in 1991, and at just 32 years old, Ellen Sheffield is a rising star on the busy city strip lined with car dealerships.
Great work with that sedan.
She was good at what she did. Good with customers, good with the technicians, always willing to help. The guys knew that they could go to her, and she had their back. And being a woman in a man's world, so to speak.
Ellen makes good money and is on track to becoming an executive, but her personal life has veered a little off course. She split from her husband David 2 years before and is raising their 7-year-old son Matt by herself.
Ellen was a very good mom from what I could see. She was very close to Matt, probably partly because it was the two of them and the two of them alone.
But not for long.
Well, from what I hear, my brother Mike met Ellen through the business.
Hey.
Hi.
You should get rid of that guy. He didn't even introduce us.
Hi, I'm Ellen, but you can call me Miss Sheffield.
Of course. I'm Mr. Snyder, but you can call me Mike.
Tell me everything about that guy.
Enter Mike Snyder, a 33-year-old master mechanic who works at another dealership on the same strip. He too is in the fast lane at work.
My brother was a very good mechanic. He didn't come easily and just fall into his lap. He worked hard, he worked long hours.
And like Ellen, Mike has recently split from his spouse.
Mike was first married to another really nice young lady. Unfortunately, she was in a very bad auto accident and had substantial injuries, and I think the struggles in their marriage seemed to overtake them, and their marriage didn't survive.
There are two slightly different versions of how Mike and Ellen actually start dating.
My perception is that Ellen pursued him. Her version is the other way around.
I heard you like one sugar and a lot of cream.
You heard right. Come on in.
Either way, they both like what they see in all sorts of ways.
She's an attractive woman. I think he's handsome, so I can see a mutual attraction both ways. I think Ellen was outgoing, so it complemented him being more quiet.
She wanted a man who was probably set and financially secure.
I was happy he found somebody after he had gone through his first divorce.
By the next fall, Ellen's divorce is finalized, and she is granted custody of her son, Matt. It's full speed ahead with Mike.
I do feel that Mike and Ellen's relationship did move quickly.
Yeah. I'm on one of that.
She moved in, pretty soon, her and her son, into my brother's home that he had in Rio Rancho. So we just supported them, and, life for them was good.
Over the next couple of years, Mike takes a special shine to young Matt, who's already showing promise as a budding mechanic.
Make sure that's good and tight now.
Matt didn't see his father, so Mike coming into his life was positive for him.
You got a real knack for that, Matt. Good job.
Time for a break for my hard-working men.
He's really good.
Less than 3 years after meeting, Ellen and Mike are married.
It was a second marriage for both of them. It was a small ceremony. Her family, her mom, her grandma, my parents were there.
Everybody was just thrilled that this young couple was married, finding each other.
As part of their new life together, they build a dream home in a posh suburb just outside the city.
Mike wanted to build his own house. He had a vision of his dream house, and he had the money to build it.
Being the type of person he was, good with his hands, and he built the house himself.
The house isn't the only thing to celebrate. By early 1995, Ellen is expecting their first child.
I know they both wanted to have a child together, even though that Ellen had, a child from another marriage.
They move into their new house in the fall of 1995.
He was real excited. They all were.
I thought my brother had a perfect life.
A perfect life that becomes even more so when their healthy baby Isabel is born just as the house is ready.
And I believe the house was finally completed before she actually arrived in the world, and they were able to take her home to a finished home.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell see great potential for success and for trouble down the line.
Overall, things look pretty good for them. They have a lot in common. Mike seems to have totally embraced Ellen's child. They really like nice things. Those things really matter to them. And some people might judge that and say that's not good. However, it could work out for them as long as they're making enough money, they're not going into debt.
Mike and Ellen both seem to be sort of workaholics, and while that is perhaps okay, it still causes concern for me about whether or not this is a couple who really ought to be thinking about growing their family. Are they in a position where they want to devote the kind of time you have to devote to being parents of a newborn baby?
When you have a family, it's really important that there's focus on the couple and on the family itself, including the kids. And when both adults' focus is primarily on work, it means that there is no one focusing on the home front. And so it worries me how this family is going to be able to stick together.
Both Ellen and Mike seem happy.
He was thrilled to be having a baby. And when she came, he was a very doting dad. I think just meant absolutely the world to him.
Close your eyes now, sleep. Daddy's here, baby girl.
He loved this little child like nobody's business.
But privately, the birth marks a turning point for the couple.
What he described as World War III was going on in the office next door.
He is not the man I married.
There was basically a second mortgage taken out.
What are you thinking, Ellen?
To the tune of over $300,000.
Ellen and Mike Snyder have every reason to be happy. They've built a dream house and welcomed their first daughter, Isabel, less than 2 years into their marriage. They make a beautiful family of 4 with Ellen's son from a previous marriage, Matt. Except that Mike and Ellen are spending less and less time at home.
After Isabel came into their lives, it seemed like maybe they started to pull apart from each other. They weren't spending a whole lot of time as a family. Both Mike and Ellen worked very long hours, and even though they loved both their children, they missed her and they wanted to be there for her, but their jobs kept them away from her at an early age.
My autograph.
The hard work pays off. Ellen is promoted to the executive level, where she becomes the supervisor to 30 mechanics. Mike is not.
Can you take her to daycare today? Big day today. I gotta crack the whip on those mechanics.
Mike was still a mechanic, so perhaps for a man it was a little degrading or, troubling to have his wife now in a position that was perhaps greater than him.
Bye. Bye.
Sadly, the promotion seems to push them further apart.
So at one point when I was at their home and saw a twin-size mattress on the floor, I was a little surprised. We found out that was where my brother, Mike, was sleeping, and that he hadn't been sleeping in the master bedroom with Ellen for quite some time.
Ellen and Mike agree it's easier this way with the new baby. Except the distance between them continues to grow, literally. By the late 1990s, Mike's work is taking him away from home, usually to Phoenix, Arizona.
Being a mechanic, you have to constantly go to training, get recertified. So that was an ongoing process for my brother throughout his career. But according to Ellen, she says that he was going much more frequently.
Then, 7 years into their marriage, the strength of their relationship is really put to the test when Mike gets sick.
Mike would have part of his body go numb. He would have tingling in his extremities. They finally determined that he had been suffering with multiple sclerosis.
MS, a progressive and highly debilitating autoimmune disorder.
When Mike was diagnosed with MS, it was a fairly devastating blow. You can imagine he was a very good mechanic, and now the thing that he did for a living, the thing he loved, he wasn't able to do as well anymore. He was in near constant pain. He was quite weak, and he had to basically stop doing what he did for a living, which, as you can imagine, put a strain on the relationship that was already pretty strained. Ellen saw that the money that had been coming in from him wasn't going to be coming in the same way anymore.
I think at this time, my brother became even more withdrawn and reserved than he was. I can't imagine really internally what he was going through. I know there were struggles that we would never understand.
One small consolation is that Mike can spend more time with his daughter.
Good day at school today? Yeah, you were a good girl?
But he complains he's not getting enough attention from the other woman in his life, his wife.
Hey, how'd it go at the doctor today?
Oh, fine. Could have been there.
I do know that for his first chemotherapy that Ellen did not go, and it was very traumatic for my brother that he had to call my mother kind of at last minute notice.
I was busy, and you were very well taken care of. Let's not make a big deal out of this, okay?
Mommy's pretty busy, isn't she?
At that point, they were clearly really strained, and she put other priorities above his needs.
An MS diagnosis is a very traumatic thing. It's a chronic illness. It can have devastating effects that can be unpredictable. Some people are better at managing it than others. This is why we have a vow that says in sickness and in health, because you really have to be able to lean on the other spouse. And I haven't seen from Mike and Ellen enough of that kind of foundation to make me confident that she's going to sort of rise to the occasion and support him when he needs it through this illness.
There are really two ways that Ellen could go when she finds out about this diagnosis. The first is she could really embrace her role as the caregiver, the breadwinner. The second alternative is that she is resentful about being put in this situation. She's worried about the fact that she's going to have to take care of him long term. So it is totally possible that the diagnosis of MS that Mike has now received could be the catalyst to bring these two together again. It is also possible that it is going to be the thing that tears them apart.
Within months of the diagnosis, the couple is clearly on the rocks.
Every year our family has a big Christmas party. And my brother, being a very good cook, he would make a big pot of pozole, which is a New Mexican dish.
Hey, brought the pozole. We can't stay.
What are you talking about?
Don't worry about it.
Look, the kids are outside. We'll come and get them in a little bit, okay?
Seriously?
We didn't see them fight, but you sure could feel the tension. They wouldn't talk, they didn't seem to act as a couple, they wouldn't communicate.
Ellen had come to work and had indicated that she had become injured breaking up a fight between her son and Mike Snyder.
Suit the glasses.
Stupid teenage family drama.
Michael and her son had gotten into a physical altercation, and she jumped into the middle in an attempt to stop that, and that's how she obtained the bruising.
A heroine caught in the crossfire. But according to a colleague, she is a victim.
On one occasion in particular, what he described as World War III was going on in the office next door.
So where that stuff just went, it just kind of magically disappeared.
He'd heard some yelling and screaming going on in the hallway just outside of Ellen's office and walked out to see what was going on.
We'll just leave now. Is everything okay?
He is not the man I married.
She indicated that there was emotional, physical, and mental abuse.
So that coworker let her borrow, for lack of a better term, his firearm.
Look, I've got something for your protection, okay? Just in case.
Ellen hides the gun at the couple's home, where she hopes Mike and the kids don't find it. Mike doesn't find the gun, but he does make a different, more shocking discovery.
There was a second mortgage taken out to the tune of over $300,000.
Hey,
We need to talk, Ellen.
about what?
Don't play dumb. What's going on with the money?
I couldn't tell you what was being done with the money, but there was definitely a money issue.
I had heard that she was gambling.
That's what the talk was.
It's really hard to know, but by the end, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars gone and not a whole lot to show for it.
We could lose everything because of you. What are you thinking, Ellen?
You're one to talk? You're not even working anymore.
Don't you walk away from me.
Oh, okay, you're okay, you're okay. All right, I got you. Okay.
Thank you.
In late 2001, Mike decides to leave Ellen and plans to head to his family's lakeside home.
He was taking things that were important to him, pictures, cards.
It was a sign of he was going to move out. He was leaving.
It seems that Ellen's debt pushed him over the edge.
Damn it!
But nobody knows the real reason Mike is planning his exit.
Mike was using those training sessions as an opportunity to have an affair.
That came out of left field, and that shocked me. I wasn't expecting anything like that.
Mike Snyder wants to leave his wife, Ellen, after less than 8 years of marriage. It might have something to do with her taking out a second mortgage on their home behind his back. Or it might not.
Done for tonight.
It's Ellen's turn to make a shocking discovery.
Mike had just gotten a new cell phone. In fact, it was the first cell phone that he had ever owned. At one point, he was out of the room, and she was looking through the phone because she was already suspicious.
What she sees and hears fills her heart with rage.
Hey, baby, missing that hot bod of yours. Looking forward to taking off your clothes and doing the nasty.
Apparently, Ellen was able to hear messages describing various sexual acts, which led her to believe that Michael was carrying on a homosexual relationship.
An affair with a man named David in Phoenix.
She believed that Mike was using those training sessions as an opportunity to meet and to have an affair with a man out in Phoenix, Arizona.
She confronts her husband.
This is what's in Phoenix?
Hey, baby, missing that
Hey, you
hot
give me
bod
that.
of yours. Looking forward to
Cheating son of a bitch. With another man?
You say what you want.
You're pathetic. I heard the message.
Whatever.
When she woke up the next morning, Mike was gone. His truck was still parked out front, and she concluded that he must have gotten a ride to the airport, presumably to go to Phoenix, Arizona, to move in with his boyfriend.
A few days later, Ellen breaks the news to Mike's sisters.
Laura, it's Ellen. I've got something to tell you.
She called me, just wanted to let you know Mike's left. She woke up and he was gone.
His sisters aren't surprised that he's left her, but they do not believe it's for another man.
There's no way. There's just absolutely no way. It wouldn't matter to me if he was, but I would see signs. I would know there'd be nothing to hide, nothing to be secretive about.
It seems that Mike's disappearance has surprised the people who knew him best. There have certainly been cases in which married men or women have left the marriage to go be in a same-sex relationship, and that has estranged them not only from their former spouse but also from their kids. And if that truly is the explanation for why Mike has disappeared, it says to me that there was some profound, long-standing dishonesty between Mike and Ellen on his part, concealing that aspect of himself.
It is possible that he has been afraid of people's reactions to what he's doing in his life, and so he has fled for that reason. It may be that he is ill and has run off to sort of die alone. Upon Mike discovering that they have such deep financial problems and that most of them are the result of Ellen and that she had been hiding it, that could have added to his desire to leave. And it's also possible that there's foul play involved.
In early April 2002, Ellen filed for divorce, and she indicated in the divorce paperwork that the reason being that Mike Snyder had abandoned her and her family.
With Mike in absentia, a judge grants her the divorce and the house, along with full custody of Isabel. To make things worse, Ellen's money troubles have finally caught up with her.
There is not an income coming in from him, so the house goes into foreclosure.
His home was free and clear until she took out that $306,000 mortgage.
While all this is going on, Mike's family can't believe he doesn't reach out to them.
I'd like to declare a missing person. It's my brother.
Mike's name goes into a national missing persons database, but as 2002 turns to 2003, nothing happens.
The police said, look, he's a grown man. He can do whatever he wants. If he wants to go to Arizona, he went to Arizona. If he wants to disappear, he can disappear.
After 2 years without a word from Mike, his father passes away.
He had been ill for some time and finally succumbed to his illness.
Family's there, friends, and Ellen and her son walked in.
Aside from the odd phone call, Mike's sisters haven't had any contact with Ellen or her son for quite some time.
We were a little surprised to see him, but, you know, okay. My dad thought fondly of both of them, so, you know.
We gave them their time, you know, to go up to the casket and share their private moments.
But Mike's stepson, 19-year-old Matt, quickly draws everyone's attention.
Matt was crying uncontrollably.
I've really never seen somebody that distraught and emotionally broke up. It was very strange.
I mean, it's not his blood grandpa. There was no extreme relationship or closeness to him and my father that would have warranted that kind of reaction.
The sad family reunion underscores the fact that nobody has seen or heard from Mike in years.
We knew by that point if he didn't show up for his dad's funeral, something had happened.
But that something won't be anything they ever would have imagined.
There's some initial digging, but they find nothing. They know exactly where he is.
The old adage rings true here, no victim, no crime.
Years have gone by since Ellen and Mike Snyder's divorce, and since the family reported him missing. When Mike doesn't show up for his own father's funeral, his sisters take action. Terry follows up with the Albuquerque Police Department on her missing persons report from 2002. In August 2005, cold case detective Mark Wilson is assigned to investigate.
My family was really close.
Okay, but did he ever mention anything at all about anybody that he knew in Phoenix?
No, and there's no way he wouldn't have told me.
So he looked into it and realized that there was absolutely zero tracking mechanisms to find Michael Snyder. Usually when people run away from their homes or their spouses, they leave some sort of trail. Very rarely have we ever seen someone run away from home and simply vanish off the face of the earth.
Mike's sisters grow more desperate and turn to a psychic for help.
Didn't really tell him a lot, kind of vague, but at one point, he told us, he goes, I feel like your brother's dead. I don't feel like he's alive.
I feel that there's foul play here. A lot of foul play here. And there are 2 people involved with this.
And it was monetary in motive.
But Detective Wilson feels otherwise when he finds evidence that points to the contrary.
Bingo.
Beginning in 2003, all the way through approximately 2006, individual returns were being filed in Mike's name.
State income taxes for the 3 years after his disappearance. In his investigation, Wilson also contacts Ellen. The tax filings are consistent with what she's been saying all along.
Your husband's returns for the last 3 years.
Ex-husband.
Ellen gives the detective what info she has.
And like I said, he's not missing. I know exactly where he is. He's on a beach somewhere with his gay lover. It's all there.
Specifically a Western Union transfer receipt that went to a location in Phoenix, Arizona. She also had credit card receipt indicating the U-Haul rental had been paid for with a credit card also in this man's name. And then also she provided several phone records which were consistent with a gay club in Phoenix, Arizona, and indicating that Mike had been calling frequently this club.
Detective Wilson sets out to find Mike's lover, David Simmons.
Using law enforcement databases, did try to track down anybody that matched that name in the Phoenix metro area.
Mike's family waits eagerly for news. But Detective Wilson doesn't have much to report.
We did look for this gay lover in Phoenix and were never able to locate him.
The income tax returns are good news and bad news. The good news is that there's a hope that he's alive and well and living somewhere. The bad news is, why haven't we heard from him and what's wrong?
The fact that Mike's family went to a psychic suggests to me that they had sort of lost faith in the police's ability to really get to the bottom of the mystery of Mike's disappearance, that they were certain, in their own minds at least, that Mike would not have disappeared and just fallen off the map voluntarily.
I don't really see this as desperation. When you have a missing family member, someone you love, you feel helpless and hopeless because you don't have any answers. And so you're looking for answers.
After months of searching, the trail comes to an abrupt halt.
Detective Mark Wilson was working the case and felt it had gone cold.
He makes a last-ditch attempt to resuscitate the case.
He requested from a local reporter with the Albuquerque Journal that they run a follow-up story about the disappearance of Mike Snyder.
And honestly, we were thrilled because to us, great, finally some action.
The Journal ran a front-page article about the disappearance of Mike and the concerns that foul play may be involved.
My husband went out to get the paper, thought it would be a little small blib, maybe on the second or third section. And I can remember my husband calling up to me from downstairs. It's on the front page. Wow, really? That article was kind of enlightening for us because they suspect foul play.
The good thing about that is that that led to some significant leads.
We received a tip from a neighbor who remembered that around the time that Michael Snyder had gone missing, she saw Ellen in the backyard of their residence digging what she said could have been a pretty deep hole.
One other thing that seemed noteworthy, one of the neighbors indicated that there was a tree that in 2001 was not in the yard And in the summer of 2002, there was a large tree that was now planted out in the backyard.
Could Mike be buried under the tree?
Detective Wilson thought that a placement of a tree was very suspect.
On June 8, 2006, a full 4.5 years after Mike went missing, cadaver dogs are brought to the house.
The house now belonged to somebody else, but they were agreeable.
Both dogs indicated that there was possible remains in and around a tree in the backyard.
And so the decision was made to dig right around the trunk of the tree, thinking that maybe there was a body that could be under the tree, and then the tree was then placed to conceal it.
And they probed it and did whatever and never found anything.
To police, the only thing that's clearly dead is the case.
The old adage rings true here, no victim, no crime.
And so once again, the search for Mike goes cold.
At this point, Mike's family has given up hope, until police get a break 4 years later.
So in January of 2010, a confidential informant came forward to the police department indicating that they had knowledge of Mike's disappearance.
Is this the breakthrough everyone has been hoping for?
I don't think they thought they were going to find anything.
Everything that the informant said had to be taken suspiciously.
Mike Snyder has been missing for 8 years. Ex-wife Ellen says he left of his own free will, and police have not been able to prove otherwise. Until a new source steps forward.
Hey, I've got some information on the Snyder case.
A confidential informant said he had information about a murder that took place several years prior, and he was referring to the death of Michael Snyder.
Police are surprised to learn the informant is an old friend of Ellen's son, Matt, and his motives seem questionable.
Ellen had fired this friend from working in the dealership where she was one of the supervisors.
You need to get out of my office. You're fired.
Because this confidential informant had an obvious reason to seek revenge against Ellen and was angry with Ellen, everything that the informant said had to be taken suspiciously.
You're not going to get away with this.
The confidential informant went on to say that Ellen's son had admitted to him that his mother had shot Michael Snyder.
Hey, man. Look, I just wanted to say it sucks about your stepdad leaving and all. You know.
He didn't leave. He's still there.
What?
And that he had helped her bury the body in the backyard of their home.
Police are dubious. They check the yard. No body. Still, the young man stands by his story and agrees to meet with Matt while the police listen in.
The cops came to see me, man. They're looking for information about you and your stepdad.
Well, just tell him you don't know anything.
I'm getting scared, man. They know things, like reports about gunshots that night, or they know the make of the gun.
Well, that's impossible.
The informant asked about whether or not Ellen's son believed that the body was still there, and he indicated that yes, to the best of his knowledge, that Mike's body would still be there.
And look, they're not going to find anything in that huge backyard.
It's enough to corroborate the story, but police need more for an arrest. So they go straight to Matt and confront him with the recording.
At night, me and my mom buried it in the hole. I don't want to go to jail.
The body is in the yard, but it's not under the tree. It's under the garage, where the dogs couldn't pick up a scent.
The house had changed significantly since the time period when Ellen and Mike had lived there in 2001, 2002.
One of the owners extended the garage from a 3-car garage to now a 6-car garage.
I don't think they thought they were going to find anything because it was a dead story to them.
8 years later, and 10 feet under, Mike Snyder's skeletal remains are finally found. He had been shot 6 times.
For the 8 years of wondering and worrying and you know, it's also just, it's overwhelming.
It's just every emotion you can possibly think of.
In exchange for his cooperation, Matt is not charged, and he tells police the whole story of what happened when he was just 17.
You're pathetic. I heard the message.
Whatever.
Ellen's son, he was woken up in the middle of the night by what he thought were gunshots.
He began to dial 911 when Ellen came to his door.
Matt, put down the phone. I need you to help me.
Matt, scared and in shock, reluctantly agrees.
They decide they're going to dig a hole in the backyard to bury Mike in. Becomes pretty clear fairly quickly that shovels are not going to do the trick. So they wait 2 days before they can get a backhoe, and they use the backhoe to dig the hole.
She and her son rolled Mike's body onto a dolly and into the hole.
And that's where they put Mike's body and bury him.
Ellen is charged with first-degree murder. She tries to claim self-defense.
You're not even working anymore.
But police and prosecutors don't buy it.
When Mike was diagnosed with MS, he was in near constant pain. He was quite weak.
No police reports were ever filed by Ellen Snyder to indicate physical domestic violence.
Police also unearth a pile of skeletons that give Ellen clear motive. In 1988, Ellen was charged and convicted of fraud and forgery and ordered to pay restitution. After Mike's disappearance, her white-collar crime spree continued.
Ellen not only was able to collect over $60,000 from Michael's 401k retirement fund, but also his disability payments from the federal government, as well as she filed 2 different tax returns under his name.
All told, she gained more than $100,000.
Nobody ever learns exactly where the money went, or if David Simmons is even real. But if he existed, he probably wasn't Mike's lover.
We were never able to corroborate whether or not that existed.
Of course, it's a made-up story on her behalf. She did it to protect herself, to keep what she had done, forgeries, fraud, pretty much stealing money.
What they do know is that when Ellen shot Mike, she emptied the clip.
Ellen kept the gun that her colleague had given her. She eventually returned it, but she returned it without any bullets, any ammunition.
I am highly skeptical of the gay romance. I'm highly skeptical of the domestic violence.
Had she been a victim, she would have had all of this time to talk about how it was self-defense, and she would have had a viable reason for wanting to kill him or killing him by accident. And so what instead she was doing is literally going about her life, acting like nothing had happened.
I think that Ellen was coldly, calculatedly creating well in advance so that she would have what she thought would be a plausible explanation for why he might want to disappear.
If I didn't already think that Ellen was a sociopath because of her ability to kill someone and act like nothing happened, I definitely would think that she could involve her son.
Prosecutors believe the killing is premeditated, but 8 years have gone by.
The statute of limitations had already run for things like manslaughter, second-degree murder, so they couldn't really prosecute her for that. So the only thing available to the prosecutors was first-degree murder, which means, of course, they have to prove intent. All it took was one juror to believe that Ellen was a battered woman and that she had been shot in self-defense. And basically, Ellen would walk away a free woman. Prosecutors didn't want to take that chance.
And so what we did is we were able to reach a resolution by a plea agreement.
Ellen pleads guilty to manslaughter, and in combination with tax fraud and tampering with evidence, she is sentenced to 11 years.
It's just a tragedy that the state law didn't put her in jail for more jail time.
What kind of mother asks her teenage son to help dispose of a body? Ellen Snyder was that kind of mother.
Isabel, at 15, goes to live with Ellen's mother, and Matt, at 26, continues to work as a mechanic, just like his stepdad, Mike, killed at the hands of Ellen Snyder.
She has no remorse, no thought for our family, and really no thought for her daughter, Isabel, who she took her father away from her.
He was a great guy. He was a good guy. He's the best brother, best father, best son anybody could have, and I'd give anything to have him back.
The Pacific Ocean is an expanse of water so unimaginably vast that it defies human comprehension, serving as a profound reminder of our absolute insignificance in the grand architecture of the natural world. When you venture far enough from the coastline, the concept of civilization begins to dissolve into the rhythmic, unrelenting motion of the waves. Out there in the deep blue, the laws that govern society on land lose their tangible grip, replaced by the ancient, unforgiving dictates of maritime survival. A ship on the open sea is not merely a vessel of transport or industry. It transforms into an isolated, floating microcosm of humanity, completely severed from the safety nets of police forces, legal jurisdictions, and immediate medical assistance. It is a closed system, a fragile steel bubble navigating through an environment that is fundamentally hostile to human life. Within this confined space, the social hierarchy becomes absolute, and the psychological pressure can compress to dangerous, unprecedented levels. The ocean does not judge, it does not intervene, and most importantly, it does not bear witness to the secrets that unfold upon its surface. This inherent isolation makes the high seas a unique theater for both the greatest feats of human endurance and the darkest manifestations of human cruelty. In February of the year 2001, the South Korean fishing vessel known as the Daeching-202 was operating within this boundless, indifferent void. It was a commercial vessel designed for the arduous task of deep-sea fishing, a floating factory where the relentless pursuit of profit often overshadowed the basic necessities of human comfort. The ship was manned by a multinational crew, a common practice in the globalized maritime industry designed to minimize operational costs. The command structure was strictly delineated by nationality and rank, with South Korean officers holding absolute authority over the vessel and its operations. Beneath them, forming the grueling backbone of the labor force, were deckhands and laborers recruited from Vietnam and Indonesia. These men had left their homes, their families, and their familiar lives, drawn by the desperate promise of wages that could secure a better future for those they left behind. They stepped onto the Detching 20 to expecting difficult work. But they could not have anticipated that they were entering a highly pressurized environment devoid of fundamental human rights or basic empathy. The conditions aboard the Detching 20 rapidly degenerated into a nightmare of systemic oppression and physical abuse. The Vietnamese crew members, trapped thousands of miles from any safe harbor, found themselves subjected to a regime of terror orchestrated by the South Korean officers. They were not treated as employees or even as fellow human beings braving the same dangerous waters. They were treated as expendable commodities. The labor was backbreaking, requiring endless hours of hauling nets and processing fish in conditions that were damp, freezing, and perpetually unsafe. Yet, the physical exhaustion was only a fraction of their torment. The officers implemented a policy of deliberate starvation, withholding adequate food to keep the laborers weak and subservient. When hunger and exhaustion inevitably slowed the pace of work, the response from the command hierarchy was not rest or sustenance, but brutal, calculated violence. The deckhands were repeatedly beaten with heavy iron pipes, their bodies absorbing the horrific impact of weapons wielded by men who knew there were no authorities around to stop them. Every blow struck with an iron pipe, every meal denied, and every relentless hour of forced labor acted as fuel added to an already unstable psychological furnace. The hull of the Detching 20 became a literal pressure cooker, trapping the abused men with their abusers in a claustrophobic space where escape was entirely impossible. The ocean surrounding them offered no refuge. It was a deep, shark-infested barrier that meant certain death for anyone attempting to flee. The daily barrage of verbal humiliation and severe physical violence stripped away the deckhands' dignity and pushed their mental endurance to the absolute breaking point. They were reduced to a state of primal survival, existing in a perpetual state of fear and suppressed rage. The officers, emboldened by the isolation of the sea and perhaps blinded by their own unchecked authority, failed to recognize that even the most submissive individuals possess a limit to the amount of suffering they can endure before the instinct for self-preservation mutates into a desperate, uncontrollable violence. The tension aboard the vessel grew thicker and more palpable with each passing day, accumulating in the dark, cramped quarters of the ship until the atmosphere itself became highly combustible, waiting only for a single spark to ignite a catastrophe. That inevitable ignition occurred on the night of February 17th, 2001, while the vessel was located not far from the port of Pago Pago in American Samoa. American Samoa is a breathtakingly beautiful territory characterized by lush, volcanic mountains that descend sharply into crystal clear waters. It is a place that evokes images of tropical serenity and peaceful isolation. Yet, just beyond the horizon of this idyllic landscape, the Detching 20 was transforming into a floating slaughterhouse. The Vietnamese crew members, having reached the absolute nadir of their suffering, secretly mobilized in the shadows of the ship. Driven by a volatile mixture of profound despair, accumulated rage, and the terrifying realization that they might not survive the voyage if the abuse continued, they made a fatal, irreversible decision. They armed themselves not with sophisticated weaponry, but with the brutal, heavy tools of their daily labor. Meat cleavers, sharp iron hooks used for hauling massive fish, and thick wooden clubs became the instruments of their sudden, explosive rebellion. The mutiny was executed with a terrifying, desperate precision, catching the South Korean officers completely off guard in the dead of the night. The uprising was not a mere protest. It was a calculated campaign of total annihilation aimed at the architects of their suffering. The violence erupted simultaneously across the vessel, shattering the quiet hum of the ship's engines with sounds of unimaginable horror. The officers were ambushed in their sleeping quarters, trapped in their beds before they could fully awaken to the nightmare unfolding around them. The ensuing chaos spilled out onto the narrow corridors and the open deck of the ship. The cramped, labyrinthine layout of the fishing vessel, which had previously served to trap the laborers, now became a deadly maze for the officers attempting to flee. The air, heavy with the scent of salt and diesel, was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, metallic odor of blood. The brutality of the assault was absolute, reflecting the sheer magnitude of the torment the mutineers had endured. 8 men, including the captain, the commanding officers, and a few crew members who had not participated in the violent uprising, were hunted down and brutally slaughtered. There was no mercy shown, no quarter given in the violent frenzy that consumed the vessel. The deck of the Detching 202, usually slick with seawater and the remnants of the catch, became drenched in the lifeblood of the men who had ruled the ship with iron fists. But the horror of that night did not end with the cessation of life. The mutineers, now in sudden, absolute control of the blood-soaked vessel, were faced with the immediate, terrifying reality of their actions. They knew that returning to any port with a ship full of murdered officers would mean an immediate end to their own lives or freedom. In a grim, calculated effort to erase the magnitude of their crime, they turned their cleavers and tools upon the lifeless bodies of their former tormentors. Under the cold, indifferent light of the Pacific moon, the perpetrators engaged in the gruesome task of dismembering the corpses. It was a scene of unparalleled cinematic horror, a macabre assembly line operating on the deck of a drifting ship. The remains of the 8 men were systematically chopped apart and cast over the side of the vessel, plunging into the dark, churning waters below. The mutineers relied on the apex predators of the ocean to complete the destruction of the evidence, trusting that the sharks and the powerful ocean currents would consume the bodies and scatter the remnants far beyond the reach of any human investigation. They scrubbed the decks, attempting to wash away the deep, crimson stains of the massacre, desperately trying to reset the reality of the ship to a state before the eruption of violence. Possessing the ruthless capability to overthrow a ship's command is vastly different from possessing the technical expertise required to navigate a massive commercial vessel across the unforgiving Pacific Ocean. The mutineers had successfully eliminated their oppressors, but in doing so, they had also eliminated the only men on board who understood the complex navigation systems and operational mechanics of the Detching 202. Without a captain to chart a course and without officers to manage the engines, the heavy steel ship became a ghost vessel. It lost all purpose and direction, surrendering completely to the whims of the wind and the powerful oceanic currents. The ship began to drift aimlessly, a silent, bloody monument to human desperation floating blindly toward the territorial waters of the United States. The United States Coast Guard maintains a vigilant watch over the waters surrounding American Samoa, serving as a critical beacon of safety, law, and order in an otherwise vast and unmonitored expanse. It is their duty to identify maritime anomalies, assist vessels in distress, and intercept potential threats. During a routine observation, Coast Guard personnel stationed near Pago Pago noticed the Detching 202. To the trained eyes of maritime professionals, a drifting ship is an immediate, glaring warning sign. A commercial vessel of that size should move with deliberate intention, maintaining a steady course and speed. The erratic, lifeless movement of the South Korean ship signaled a profound failure on board. A Coast Guard cutter was swiftly dispatched to intercept the vessel, approaching the silent, towering hull with growing apprehension. When the heavily armed Coast Guard boarding party finally stepped onto the deck of the Detching 202, they were met with an eerie, unnatural silence that contrasted sharply with the massive size of the industrial ship. The meticulous efforts of the mutineers to wash away the evidence had ultimately failed. The boarding team immediately detected the unmistakable, coppery scent of blood that lingered stubbornly in the humid ocean air. As they moved cautiously across the deck and through the narrow corridors, their flashlights illuminated the grim, undeniable signs of a massive, violent struggle. Dark, dried stains of blood were visible in the crevices of the deck, splashed against the bulkheads, and pooled in hidden corners. But the most haunting element of the discovery was not the physical evidence of the violence. It was the faces of the surviving crew members. The men who emerged from the shadows of the ship were deeply traumatized, their eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock, lingering terror, and the heavy, crushing weight of what they had done. They were the architects of a massacre, yet they also bore the unmistakable physical and psychological scars of severe, prolonged abuse. The Coast Guard officers found themselves standing at the epicenter of a horrific tragedy, looking at individuals who simultaneously occupied the roles of brutal murderers and desperate victims. The discovery of the Detching to Zero tool was the initiation of an unimaginably complex legal and moral nightmare. The initial investigation immediately highlighted a severe jurisdictional crisis that would complicate the pursuit of justice. The vessel flew the flag of South Korea. The murdered men were South Korean citizens, and the perpetrators were primarily Vietnamese nationals. However, the vessel had been intercepted and the crime discovered within the territorial waters overseen by the United States, specifically the jurisdiction of American Samoa. This unprecedented entanglement of international maritime law, conflicting national interests, and the sheer brutality of the crime created a legal labyrinth. The case was ultimately transferred to the federal courts in Honolulu, Hawaii, setting the stage for a trial that would force the world to confront the dark, hidden realities of human rights abuses on the high seas. The story of the Detching to Zero transcends a simple narrative of murder. It is a profound, disturbing exploration of what happens when human beings are stripped of their dignity, isolated from society, and pushed into a corner where violence becomes the only perceived mechanism for survival. The courtroom in Honolulu would not only weigh the guilt of the men who wielded the cleavers, but it would also inadvertently put the entire unregulated, brutal system of the deep-sea fishing industry on trial, forcing society to look closely at the true, human cost of the harvest pulled from the indifferent depths of the Pacific Ocean. To understand the sheer brutality that unfolded on the deck of the Detching to Zero, one must first comprehend the unforgiving nature of the commercial deep-sea fishing industry at the dawn of the 21st century. This is not the romanticized version of seafaring found in ancient literature or modern cinema. It is a grueling, mechanized pursuit of ocean resources where the bottom line dictates every action, every decision, and ultimately, every human interaction. The men who command these vessels are under astronomical pressure from corporate owners back on the mainland to return with holds filled to absolute capacity. Failure to meet these demanding quotas means financial ruin, loss of employment, and a swift descent into poverty. The ocean is vast, but the profit margins are incredibly narrow, creating an environment where human compassion is frequently sacrificed at the altar of economic efficiency. This relentless financial pressure cascades downward through the rigid hierarchy of the ship, transforming ordinary men into harsh taskmasters who view their subordinate crew not as human beings, but as organic machinery designed solely to extract wealth from the freezing depths. The Detching to Zero was a physical manifestation of this ruthless industrial philosophy. It was a massive steel leviathan, a floating factory built for endurance and high-yield extraction rather than human comfort. The architecture of the vessel itself reinforced the strict social stratification that governed life on board. The upper decks housed the South Korean officers, providing them with relatively spacious quarters, private facilities, and access to fresh air. Below the waterline, in the cramped, perpetually damp, and poorly ventilated bowels of the ship, resided the manual laborers recruited from Vietnam and Indonesia. The separation was absolute and intentional, designed to maintain a psychological barrier between the commanders and the commanded. The noise of the massive diesel engines was a constant, deafening roar in the lower decks, making sleep a luxury and peace an impossibility. The air was thick with the inescapable stench of diesel fuel, sweat, and rotting fish, a sensory assault that slowly eroded the mental fortitude of the men trapped within its confines. The individuals who occupied the upper echelons of this floating hierarchy were South Korean nationals, men who had dedicated their lives to the punishing demands of the sea. Among them were the captain and his immediate subordinate officers, the very men who would eventually become the victims of the horrific massacre. It is crucial to view these men not simply as one-dimensional villains, but as complex individuals shaped by a harsh industry. They were sons, husbands, and fathers who had families waiting for their safe return in port cities across South Korea. They carried the heavy burden of command in an environment where a single mistake could cost the lives of everyone on board. However, the isolation of the deep ocean has a corrosive effect on the human soul. Removed from the checks and balances of civilized society and burdened by the immense pressure to deliver a profitable catch, The officers of the Detching to Zero began to wield their absolute authority with increasingly terrifying cruelty. The power dynamic on the ship became severely warped, transforming a professional chain of command into a tyrannical regime. For the South Korean officers, the foreign laborers were a cheap, expendable resource necessary for the grueling, manual labor that kept a floating factory operational. The language barrier further dehumanized the deckhands, reducing complex human interactions to shouted commands, frustrated gestures, and eventually physical violence. When communication failed or when exhaustion slowed the pace of work, the officers did not seek to understand or to motivate through leadership. They resorted to the basest forms of coercion. The officers, perhaps driven by their own anxieties regarding quotas and the unforgiving nature of their corporate overseers, externalized their immense stress onto the men trapped below deck. This psychological detachment allowed them to inflict suffering without the burden of empathy. Viewing the injuries and the exhaustion of the Vietnamese crew as mere operational delays rather than human tragedies. The isolation of the Pacific Ocean provided a dark cloak of anonymity, convincing the officers that their actions would never face the scrutiny of the law or the moral judgment of the mainland. On the lowest rung of this brutal hierarchy were the laborers, primarily young men from impoverished coastal villages in Vietnam. These individuals were drawn to the perilous life of deep-sea fishing by the desperate promise of a steady income. They signed contracts with international labor brokers, often taking on significant financial debt to secure their positions on the vessel. They embarked on the Detching to Zero carrying the heavy hopes of their entire families, believing that enduring a few years of hardship on the open sea would secure a better future for their loved ones back home. They were profoundly resilient individuals, accustomed to hard work and difficult living conditions. However, nothing in their past experiences could have adequately prepared them for the systematic abuse and the complete deprivation of human dignity that awaited them on the South Korean vessel. They entered a situation where they were fundamentally powerless, trapped on a ship thousands of miles from their homeland with no means of communication, no legal recourse, and absolutely no avenue for escape. The daily reality for the Vietnamese deckhands was a horrifying descent into modern-day slavery. Their working hours were dictated not by the limits of human endurance, but by the availability of fish and the arbitrary demands of the officers. They were frequently forced to work 20 hours a day, hauling massive, freezing nets out of the turbulent ocean, sorting the catch on the slippery, hazardous deck, and operating heavy machinery with little to no safety training. The physical toll was devastating. Their hands were perpetually raw and bleeding from the coarse ropes and the sharp fins of the fish. Their muscles ached with a deep, persistent agony that was never given the opportunity to heal. Yet, the physical labor, as excruciating as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological torment inflicted by the systematic deprivation of their most basic human needs. The officers, utilizing food as a weapon of ultimate control, implemented a policy of deliberate starvation. The withholding of adequate sustenance was a calculated strategy designed to keep the laborers weak, subservient, and entirely dependent on the meager rations distributed at the whim of the command structure. The Vietnamese crew members were denied the energy necessary to sustain the massive physical exertion required by their labor. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence, a physical pain that amplified their exhaustion and eroded their cognitive functions. The agonizing ache of an empty stomach, combined with the extreme sleep deprivation, pushed the men toward the very edges of physical and mental collapse. The deliberate starvation was an act of profound cruelty, a constant reminder of their absolute vulnerability and their complete lack of agency within the closed system of the ship. It was a strategy intended to break their spirits, to ensure that they lacked the physical strength and the mental clarity to even contemplate resistance. However, this cruel methodology fundamentally miscalculated the complex nature of human desperation. As the physical conditions deteriorated, the violence escalated from verbal abuse to brutal physical assaults. The officers, frustrated by the inevitable decline in productivity caused by exhaustion and starvation, began to utilize heavy iron pipes as instruments of discipline. These pipes, originally intended for ship maintenance, became terrifying weapons of subjugation. Minor infractions, a moment of rest, or a perceived lack of speed were met with vicious beatings. The thick iron rods struck human bone and flesh with sickening force, leaving deep bruises, fractured limbs, and profound psychological scars. The deck of the Detching to Zero became an arena of arbitrary violence, where the laborers lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, anticipating the next brutal blow. The pain was excruciating, but the sheer humiliation of being beaten like animals, without any possibility of defending themselves, ignited a dark, smoldering fury deep within the collective psyche of the Vietnamese crew. The dynamic between the oppressors and the oppressed reached a critical, unsustainable threshold in the days leading up to the massacre. The South Korean officers, blinded by their unchecked authority and perhaps desensitized to the suffering they were inflicting, failed to recognize the subtle, dangerous shifts occurring below deck. They viewed the silence of the Vietnamese laborers as complete submission, completely unaware that it was, in fact, the silence of a desperate, cornered prey preparing to strike. The officers continued their brutal regime, completely oblivious to the fact that they were systematically forging the very weapons that would be used against them. Every blow from the iron pipe, every meal denied, and every degrading insult was meticulously documented in the collective memory of the abused men. The shared trauma forged an unbreakable bond among the laborers, transforming a disparate group of desperate individuals into a unified, highly volatile force driven by the primal imperative of survival. The psychological transformation of the Vietnamese crew was slow, but absolute. The continuous exposure to extreme violence and deprivation stripped away the thin veneer of civilized restraint. The desperate need to survive superseded all moral, ethical, and legal considerations. They realized with chilling clarity that their survival was entirely incompatible with the continued existence of the South Korean officers. The ship, once viewed as a vehicle for economic salvation, had become an inescapable floating tomb. The vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific Ocean offered no rescue, no intervention, and absolutely no hope. The men were entirely isolated, abandoned by the world, and left to the mercy of individuals who had demonstrated a complete absence of compassion. In the dark, suffocating confines of the lower decks, whispered conversations began to circulate, transforming the abstract concept of resistance into a concrete, terrifying plan for absolute retribution. The victims of the impending massacre, the South Korean captain and his officers, were entirely unaware of the lethal storm gathering beneath their feet. They went about their daily routines, managing the navigation of the vessel, monitoring the fishing equipment, and enforcing their brutal discipline, completely isolated in their positions of power. They slept in their quarters, believing themselves to be secure behind locked doors and the established hierarchy of the maritime world. They trusted in the absolute authority of their ranks, failing to comprehend that authority is a fragile construct that shatters completely when individuals are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The officers perceived the Vietnamese crew as weak, broken tools, vastly underestimating the explosive power of desperation and the profound, terrifying strength that is born when a human being has absolutely nothing left to lose. The atmosphere on the Detching 202 in the mid-days of February became unbearably dense, charged with an invisible, lethal tension. The brutalized laborers moved through their tasks with a cold, mechanical precision, their eyes fixed firmly downward, avoiding any eye contact that might provoke another assault. Beneath this facade of absolute submission, a desperate, meticulous planning process was underway. The men began to quietly inventory the heavy tools scattered across the ship, assessing their potential as weapons of close quarters combat. Meat cleavers from the galley, long iron hooks used for maneuvering heavy nets, and solid wooden clubs were secretly secured and hidden in accessible locations. The mutiny was not a spontaneous eruption of chaotic anger. It was a deliberate, calculated, and highly organized strategy for survival, orchestrated by men who had meticulously analyzed their dire situation and concluded that extreme violence was their only remaining option. To fully understand the tragedy of the Detching 202, One must hold to opposing truths simultaneously. The South Korean officers were the undeniable architects of a horrific, systematic regime of abuse that stripped Vietnamese laborers of their basic humanity. Yet, these officers were also human beings, men with families and histories, who would suffer a terrifying, agonizing death in the dark confines of the ocean. Their brutal actions created the very conditions that ensured their own violent destruction. They constructed a pressurized environment of absolute cruelty, sealing the vessel tight with their tyranny, and completely failing to realize that the immense pressure they were applying would inevitably lead to a catastrophic, deadly explosion. The tragedy lies in the absolute breakdown of human empathy, a devastating failure that transformed a commercial fishing vessel into a theater of unimaginable slaughter. The backdrop of this impending horror was the breathtaking beauty of the South Pacific Ocean. The waters surrounding American Samoa are renowned for their vibrant marine life, their crystal-clear depths, and their serene, majestic currents. It is an environment that inspires awe and a profound sense of peace. Yet, this natural beauty served as a stark, chilling contrast to the dark, violent reality unfolding on the deck of the South Korean vessel. The ocean was completely indifferent to the suffering of the men trapped on the ship. The waves continued their eternal, rhythmic dance, the sun rose and set with unyielding predictability, and the deep waters remained silent, completely unconcerned with the impending massacre. This profound contrast between the serene indifference of the natural world and the agonizing cruelty of human interaction amplifies the deep, chilling horror of the narrative. As the vessel drifted closer to the island of Tutula in American Samoa, the countdown to the eruption of violence reached its final, agonizing moments. The Vietnamese crew members, having finalized their desperate plans, waited for the optimal moment to strike. They waited for the deep cover of night, for the exhaustion of the officers to take hold, and for the ship to fall into a deceptive, vulnerable quiet. The air grew colder as the sun disappeared below the horizon, plunging the vessel into a profound, isolating darkness. The heavy thrum of the diesel engines was the only sound that penetrated the silence, a constant, rhythmic heartbeat that masked the rapid, terrified breathing of the men preparing to commit the ultimate act of rebellion. The stage was set, the actors were positioned, and the floating pressure cooker was mere seconds away from a catastrophic, bloody rupture that would forever alter the lives of everyone on board and leave a permanent, indelible stain on the history of international maritime labor. The background of the Detching 20 incident is a complex, deeply disturbing tapestry woven from the dark threads of extreme economic pressure, unchecked authority, severe isolation, and absolute human desperation. It forces a profound examination of the hidden costs of global industries and the terrifying consequences of systematically stripping individuals of their fundamental dignity. The men who sailed on this doomed vessel were all victims of a deeply flawed, inherently abusive system, a system that prioritized the extraction of wealth over the preservation of human life. The South Korean officers were consumed by the toxic power dynamics of the industry, while the Vietnamese laborers were pushed into a dark, terrifying corner where monstrous violence became synonymous with survival. The portrait of this doomed vessel is a chilling testament to the fragile nature of civilization and the immense, terrifying darkness that can consume the human soul when it is abandoned in the vast, indifferent expanse of the open ocean. The night of February 17th, 2001 descended upon the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean with a heavy, suffocating darkness. The Detching 20 was positioned in the restless waters just off the coast of Pago Pago, American Samoa. This geographic location usually promised safe harbor and much-needed respite for weary sailors. However, within the rusted steel hull of this particular South Korean fishing vessel, there was absolutely no peace. There was only the terrible, absolute culmination of weeks of relentless physical and psychological torment. The ocean swells rocked the heavy ship with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a natural, calming motion that stood in stark, chilling contrast to the violently erratic heartbeats of the terrified men confined in the lower decks. The massive diesel engines of the commercial vessel hummed with a low, constant vibration that reverberated deeply through the metal bulkheads. This mechanical drone served a dual purpose. It propelled the ship and effectively masked the subtle, terrifying sounds of a mutiny entering its final, lethal stages of preparation. The air below deck was thick with the oppressive humidity of the tropical latitude, mingling sickeningly with the inescapable stench of diesel fuel, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of unadulterated fear. The South Korean officers, entirely oblivious to the lethal storm they had meticulously engineered through their own brutal actions, had retired to their quarters for the night. Completely unaware of the impending doom, they slept soundly in the relative comfort of the upper decks, their bodies exhausted from the demanding daily requirements of maritime command. Their minds were completely secure in the deeply flawed assumption that their absolute authority extended seamlessly into the dark shadows of the sleeping ship. The officers genuinely believed that the foreign laborers trapped below were thoroughly broken, physically incapable of anything beyond desperate survival and blind, unquestioning obedience. This profound miscalculation of human endurance, this arrogant underestimation of the breaking point of abused men, would soon become the fatal error that sealed their brutal doom. Down in the dimly lit, claustrophobic crew quarters, the Vietnamese laborers were definitely not sleeping. They were frozen in a state of hyper-vigilant anticipation, their eyes fully adjusted to the gloom, their muscles coiled with an agonizing mixture of terror and unyielding resolve. The invisible threshold of their physical and mental endurance had been completely crossed. This crossing left behind the paralyzing fear of their violent oppressors and abruptly replaced it with the cold, absolute necessity of proactive violence. The silence in the lower deck was not the silence of rest, but the breathless, heavy quiet of a desperate predator preparing to strike its unsuspecting prey. The orchestrator of this desperate uprising, a man clearly identified in the historical records as Nguyen Van Chek, moved through the shadows. He moved with a grim, intensely focused determination that betrayed the severity of the moment. He was not a hardened criminal by nature, but the brutal, daily crucible of the detching to zero had fundamentally altered his psychological composition. The abuse had forged him into the reluctant, lethal spearhead of the bloody rebellion. Through a series of silent gestures and urgent, whispered commands that barely registered over the constant drone of the ship engines, the mutineers began to execute their meticulously coordinated plan. They moved with the eerie stealth of ghosts through the narrow, highly hazardous corridors of the industrial vessel, their bare feet making absolutely no sound on the cold steel plates. The heavy tools of their daily, grueling labor, previously used exclusively to extract marine life from the ocean, were now rapidly repurposed into instruments of profound human destruction. Heavy meat cleavers, usually confined strictly to the galley for the purpose of processing massive fish, gleamed dimly in the sparse, flickering artificial light of the ship. Long, solid iron hooks, specifically designed for hauling heavy nets and dragging the slippery catch across the wide deck, were gripped tightly in calloused, severely battered hands. Solid wooden clubs, hastily improvised from the structural debris of the ship, were hefted quietly to gauge their lethal weight and destructive momentum. These were certainly not sophisticated or modern weapons by any standard, but in the tightly confined, brutal environment of the fishing ship, they were instruments of terrifying, undeniable efficiency. The desperate men wielding them were driven by a primal, singular objective that eclipsed all other thoughts, the complete and utter eradication of the command structure that had subjected them to a living, inescapable hell. The fundamental psychological barrier that typically prevents human beings from taking the life of another had been completely obliterated. It was erased by the systematic starvation and the vicious, daily beatings they had endured without recourse. As they quietly ascended the narrow metal stairways leading directly to the upper decks, they symbolically left their fragile humanity behind in the lower holds. They emerged into the upper sections of the ship as dark, vengeful silhouettes starkly contrasted against the mechanical, unforgiving backdrop of the vessel. The highly anticipated assault commenced with a sudden, explosive violence that instantly and permanently shattered the deceptive tranquility of the oceanic night. The organized mutineers breached the sleeping quarters of the South Korean officers with a terrifying, synchronized coordination. They moved rapidly from the dark shadows directly into the illuminated spaces of absolute authority with explicitly lethal intent. There was absolutely no hesitation in their movements, no opportunity offered for desperate negotiation, and absolutely no verbal or physical warning given to the men sleeping inside the cramped rooms. The commanding officers were violently and abruptly ripped from the extreme vulnerability of deep sleep. Their sudden, chaotic awakening was instantly met with the horrific, blinding reality of heavy, swinging iron and sharp, descending steel. The highly confined spaces of the cabins, measuring only a few precious square feet, immediately became inescapable, blood-soaked slaughterhouses. The air, which moments previously had been heavy with quiet sleep, was suddenly torn apart by the sickening sounds of blunt force impact. The terrible noise of tearing metal forcefully penetrating human flesh mixed with the desperate, gurgling cries of men fighting a rapidly losing battle for their very lives in the dark. The captain of the ship, the primary architect of the oppressive, violent regime, and his immediate, complicit subordinates found themselves completely and utterly defenseless. They could not stand against the overwhelming, chaotic fury of the very men they had ruthlessly tortured for weeks. The heavy, improvised weapons swung with the terrifying, unstoppable strength of absolute human desperation. Each brutal blow was driven by weeks of deeply accumulated, suppressed rage and the blinding, primal instinct for immediate self-preservation. Hot blood splattered violently against the pristine white bulkheads of the cabins, painting the previously clean walls with the chaotic, crimson signatures of a total massacre. The physical struggle was brutal, incredibly chaotic, and mercifully brief for the victims. The targeted officers, heavily disoriented by the sheer suddenness of the violent attack and hopelessly trapped in their narrow, restrictive bunks, were systematically butchered. The fatal blows landed repeatedly before the victims could even fully comprehend the identity of their relentless attackers. This initial, critical phase of the mutiny was executed with a dark, completely ruthless efficiency, leaving the small cabin slick with fresh blood and completely devoid of human life. However, the sheer magnitude of the violence could not be contained entirely within the isolated sleeping quarters. The horrific, unmistakable noise of the slaughter, rising sharply above the constant mechanical hum of the ship, instantly alerted the remaining individuals on board. Panic immediately and completely seized the vessel as those who had not been in the initial targeted cabins realized that a massive massacre was currently underway. Among the potential targets were not only the remaining South Korean officers, but also several ordinary crew members. This included Indonesians and other Vietnamese laborers who had either explicitly refused to participate in the mutiny or were simply caught tragically in the crossfire of the indiscriminate, explosive rage. The mutineers were now heavily intoxicated by the surging adrenaline of the initial successful killings. They were deeply terrified of leaving any living witnesses who could potentially compromise their fragile, newly acquired grip on survival and freedom. Consequently, they rapidly turned their deadly attention to the rest of the frightened ship. The Detching 20 instantly transformed into a terrifying, labyrinthine hunting ground for the desperate killers. The narrow, confusing corridors, the steep, treacherous metal ladders, and the open, exposed expanse of the main deck became the terrifying stages for a desperate, frantic pursuit of human life. The terrified victims ran blindly through the dark spaces, their heavy footsteps echoing loudly on the steel grating. They were desperately seeking a secure hiding place on a vessel that offered absolutely no physical sanctuary from the violence. But the determined mutineers knew every single inch of the commercial ship. They actively hunted down the terrified, fleeing survivors with a cold, systematic, and completely unwavering ruthlessness. Desperate men were violently cornered in the deep storage holds, forcefully dragged from beneath heavy, oily machinery, and violently intercepted on the slippery, salt-encrusted main deck. The heavy iron hooks, swung with terrifying, lethal momentum, consistently found their marks in the dark shadows of the ship. The thick, heavy wooden clubs brutally crushed human bone and permanently extinguished the desperate, tearful pleas for mercy. The violent, unstoppable purge swept rapidly across the entire vessel, entirely indiscriminate in its absolute brutality. In the devastating end, 8 men lay completely dead, their broken bodies scattered randomly. The corpses lay across the various decks of the ship, serving as a grim, silent testament to the absolute, catastrophic breakdown of human order and basic morality. The mutineers stood victorious amidst the horrifying carnage, their work clothes heavily soaked in the warm blood of their former, abusive masters. Their chests were heaving deeply with the immense, agonizing physical exertion of the prolonged slaughter. But the heavy silence that followed the explosive violence was definitely not a silence of relief or peace. It was a profound, deeply chilling quiet that sharply underscored the monstrous, irreversible reality of what they had just physically accomplished. The immediate, bloody aftermath of the massacre presented the killers with a new terror. They faced a terrifying, incredibly complex logistical problem that demanded an immediate, gruesome solution. The entire ship was literally littered with the broken bodies of 8 men. This was the undeniable physical evidence of a maritime crime so horrific that it would absolutely guarantee their immediate execution if discovered by any international maritime authority. The powerful instinct for continued survival, having initially driven them to commit mass murder, now drove them to execute a calculated, deeply horrifying act of grotesque physical desecration. Under the cold, completely indifferent illumination of the bright Pacific moon, the perpetrators initiated the absolute darkest, most disturbing chapter of the long night. They gathered their weapons once again. Using the exact same heavy meat cleavers that had initiated the initial slaughter, they calmly began the methodical, deeply horrifying process of physical dismemberment. The main deck of the Detching 202, already incredibly slick and dangerous with pooled blood, literally became an open-air, floating abattoir. The lifeless bodies of the former officers and the unfortunate, innocent crewmen were systematically and brutally chopped into smaller, manageable pieces. This was a desperate, deeply terrifying effort to completely erase the identities and the very physical existence of the victims. As the heavy, sharp blades fell repeatedly, severing human limbs and actively destroying undeniable evidence, the gruesome remnants of the dead were callously gathered. The severed pieces were forcefully hurled over the rusted, salt-stained railing of the fishing ship. The dark, violently churning waters of the deep Pacific Ocean swallowed the human remains instantly and completely. The oceanic waters located just off the coast of Pago Pago are notoriously and heavily inhabited by incredibly large populations of aggressive, predatory sharks. These deadly creatures were instantly drawn by the massive, thick scent of human blood that now heavily saturated the surrounding ocean currents. The desperate mutineers relied entirely and completely on these apex marine predators of the deep sea to rapidly consume the horrific physical evidence of their monstrous, violent actions aboard the ship. They stood near the railing, covered in blood, silently hoping that the vast, completely unforgiving ocean would serve as an absolute, impenetrable, and eternal grave. They prayed that the dark waters would forever conceal the unimaginable horrors that had violently transpired upon its surface during that fatal night. The absolute silence that followed the horrific disposal of the bodies was more terrifying than the cacophony of the slaughter itself. A heavy and unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the rusted hull of the Detching 202. The Vietnamese crew members stood on the blood-slick deck, their hands trembling and their chests heaving, staring out at the black expanse of the Pacific where the remnants of their former masters had vanished moments before. The adrenaline that had fueled their desperate uprising was rapidly receding, leaving behind a cold and paralyzing realization of the vacuum they had created. In the violent pursuit of their freedom, they had systematically eliminated every single individual on board who possessed the specialized knowledge required to operate the massive vessel. They were no longer slaves to a brutal command, but they were now prisoners of a drifting steel island floating aimlessly in one of the most remote regions of the planet. The heavy smell of the ocean air, once a symbol of the world beyond their reach, now felt like a suffocating shroud. They had effectively severed their connection to the human world, and the vast, indifferent ocean was the only witness to their isolation. The transition from a highly organized killing force back into a group of desperate, unskilled laborers was instantaneous and devastating. The bridge of the ship, the sanctuary of the officers they had just butchered, now sat empty and hauntingly quiet. The complex arrays of glowing dials, radar screens, and navigational computers hummed with an electronic indifference, displaying coordinates and headings that were entirely meaningless to the men who now stood before them. They had spent their lives in small coastal villages or on simple wooden boats where navigation was a matter of tradition and instinct, not satellite telemetry and computerized engine management. As they looked at the steering wheel and the throttle levers, a profound sense of helplessness began to take root. They had committed mass murder to escape a living hell, only to find themselves trapped in a different kind of purgatory. The ship was alive, its engines still thrumming with a rhythmic heartbeat, but it was brain dead, drifting without a pilot or a purpose toward the territorial waters of American Samoa. For several days, the Dutching to Zero became a ghost ship, a floating monument to a tragedy that the world did not yet know had occurred. The mutineers attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy, scrubbing the decks with seawater in a futile attempt to erase the deep crimson stains that had soaked into the very pores of the metal. They moved through the corridors with a hollow, haunted look in their eyes, avoiding the areas of the ship where the violence had been most intense. The psychological weight of what they had done began to fracture their fragile unity. Some believed they could somehow navigate the ship to a neutral territory or perhaps scuttle it and take their chances in the lifeboats, while others were simply catatonic, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of their crimes. They were trapped in a loop of terror, staring at the horizon for a sign of land that represented both salvation from the sea and certain capture by the law. Every shadow on the water and every sound of the shifting hull felt like a precursor to their inevitable discovery. While the mutineers struggled with their internal demons and their technical incompetence, the maritime authorities of American Samoa were beginning to take notice of a growing anomaly on their radar screens. The United States Coast Guard, operating out of the strategic port of Pago Pago, maintained a sophisticated surveillance net designed to monitor the heavy traffic of the tuna fishing fleets. A drifting vessel is a red flag in the professional world of maritime security, as it indicates either a mechanical failure, a medical emergency, or something much more sinister. The Dutching to Zero had stopped transmitting its expected position reports and was moving in a pattern that defied all logic of commercial fishing. It was not following the currents in a natural way, nor was it maintaining a heading toward any known fishing ground or port. To the seasoned observers at the Coast Guard station, the South Korean ship looked like a wounded animal circling aimlessly in the water. After 48 hours of unresponsiveness to radio hails, the decision was made to dispatch a cutter to conduct a welfare check and a boarding operation. The approach of the Coast Guard cutter was a moment of absolute, heart-stopping terror for the men on the Dutching to Zero. As the sleek white hull of the American vessel appeared on the horizon, the mutineers realized that their desperate gamble to hide the evidence had reached its end. They watched as the distance between the two ships closed, the powerful engines of the cutter carving through the waves with a precision they could never hope to match. Panic erupted on the deck. Some argued for a final, suicidal stand against the boarding party, while others began to weep, realizing that the long night of their suffering was about to enter a new legal phase. They had no story to tell that could explain the absence of 8 men, and they lacked the sophistication to maintain a lie under the intense scrutiny of federal investigators. As the Coast Guard personnel donned their tactical gear and prepared their boarding ladders, the Vietnamese laborers retreated into a defensive huddle, waiting for the inevitable moment when the world would finally step onto their blood-soaked stage. The boarding operation itself was a masterclass in tactical caution. The Coast Guard officers, trained to expect the unexpected, approached the Dutching to Zero with weapons drawn, their eyes scanning every inch of the towering steel hull. When they finally vaulted over the railing and landed on the deck, they were immediately struck by the unnatural atmosphere of the ship. There was no one at the helm, no one managing the gear, and the men they encountered were not the typical, salt-hardened crew of a South Korean fishing vessel. Instead, they found a group of gaunt, traumatized laborers who looked at them with a mixture of profound relief and shattering guilt. The smell was the first definitive clue that something was horribly wrong. Even after days of scrubbing, the coppery, unmistakable scent of human blood lingered in the humid tropical air, a ghost that refused to be banished. The boarding officer, a man who had seen his share of maritime accidents, later described the feeling as stepping into a tomb that had been recently and violently disturbed. The investigation began in the narrow corridors and the cramped cabins that had served as the theater for the massacre. The Coast Guard team moved methodically through the ship, their high-powered flashlights cutting through the gloom of the lower decks. They found the first traces of evidence in the gaps between the floor plates and behind the machinery in the galley. Tiny splatters of blood, missed by the frantic cleanup, told a story of a struggle that had moved from room to room. In the officers' quarters, the signs of a struggle were more pronounced. Despite the missing furniture and the freshly washed walls, the investigators found ghosting patterns where blood had sprayed against the bulkheads before being wiped away. The forensic reality of the situation was becoming clear. A massive act of violence had occurred on this vessel, and there were no bodies to account for it. The absence of the South Korean officers was not a matter of a missing lifeboat or an accidental drowning. It was a void left by a calculated purge. The nth or the critical knot in the investigation arrived when the authorities began to separate the survivors for questioning. This was a painstaking process complicated by the severe language barrier and the deep-seated fear the Vietnamese men held for any uniformed authority. Working with translators through the night in the secure facilities of Pago Pago, the investigators began to piece together a narrative that was far more complex than a simple case of mutiny. The laborers, one by one, began to break their silence, their stories flowing out in a torrent of pent-up trauma. They spoke of the iron pipes, the starvation, the days without sleep, and the absolute conviction that they were going to be killed by the officers if they did not strike first. They pointed to the scars on their own bodies as evidence of the regime they had overthrown. This was the moment the investigation shifted from a search for perpetrators to a deep dive into the harrowing reality of human rights abuses on the high seas. The investigators were forced to confront a disturbing truth. The men in their custody were indeed killers, but they were also survivors of a system that had effectively stripped them of their humanity. The forensic team eventually turned their attention to the sea itself, utilizing sonar and divers to search the waters where the ship had been drifting. While the ocean is a vast graveyard, the specific coordinates of the Detching 202's drift allowed the authorities to narrow their search. They did not expect to find intact bodies, given the presence of sharks and the time that had elapsed, but they were looking for any scrap of evidence that could corroborate the laborers' stories. Back on the ship, the discovery of the hidden weapons, the meat cleavers, and the iron hooks that had been hastily stashed in the engine room provided the physical link between the survivors and the missing officers. The DNA found on these tools was the final, irrefutable proof of the massacre. The investigation had moved with incredible speed, transforming a mysterious drifting ship into a fully documented crime scene of international proportions. However, as the physical evidence was being cataloged, the legal complexity of the case began to emerge as the true challenge. The Detching 202 sat in the harbor of Pago Pago, a silent witness to a crime that didn't neatly fit into any single box. The crimes were committed by Vietnamese nationals against South Koreans on a South Korean flagship, but they were intercepted by the United States. The question of who had the right to prosecute these men and under what laws became a subject of intense debate between the State Department and the Department of Justice. The world was watching, and the decision made in American Samoa would set a precedent for how the international community handled the volatile intersection of maritime labor, human rights, and capital crimes. The mutineers, now shackled and confined in a land they had never heard of, could only wait as the gears of a massive, alien legal system began to turn. A system that promised a type of justice they had never known on the open sea. The final step of the initial investigation was the formal identification of the lead mutineers. Through consistent testimonies and the analysis of the ship's internal dynamics, Nguyen Vinh Chuc was identified as the catalyst for the uprising. The investigators focused on his psychological state, trying to understand how a simple laborer had become the commander of a massacre. Chuck's demeanor during the interrogations was not one of a defiant criminal. but of a man who had made a binary choice between life and death and was now prepared to accept whatever consequence followed. This clarity of purpose, born from the absolute depths of despair, was the most chilling aspect for the American investigators. They realized that they were not just dealing with a murder case, but with the aftermath of a psychological explosion. The end that was finally untied, revealing a tragic reality where everyone involved, the murdered and the murderers, were victims of a maritime industry that had operated for too long in the shadows of the law, allowing a pressure cooker of human suffering to detonate with horrific, irreversible force. The transition from the blood-slicked, chaotic deck of the Detching to Zero to the sterile, mahogany-paneled environment of a United States federal courthouse was a jarring shift that underscored the reach of international law. The case was moved from the remote outpost of American Samoa to Honolulu, Hawaii, a city that serves as the legal and administrative hub for the American Pacific. Here, in a high-security courtroom, the raw and primal violence of the high seas was distilled into legal motions, forensic reports, and technical testimonies. The defendants, who had once been the masters of a mutinous vessel, now appeared as small, gaunt figures swallowed by the formality of their surroundings. They were dressed in standard-issue prison jumpsuits, their faces etched with the lingering trauma of both the abuse they had suffered and the horrific crimes they had committed. The trial of the Detching to Zero was not merely a criminal proceeding. It was a complex diplomatic and legal puzzle that challenged the traditional boundaries of national sovereignty and maritime jurisdiction. The first major hurdle for the prosecution was establishing the legal right of the United States to try foreign nationals for crimes committed on a foreign-flagged vessel against foreign victims. Under international maritime law, a ship is generally considered a floating piece of its home nation's territory, which would normally mean that South Korea held the primary right to prosecute. However, because the vessel had been intercepted and brought into the American port of Pago Pago by the United States Coast Guard, the case fell under the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States. This legal mechanism allows American courts to intervene in cases of piracy, murder, and other serious crimes on the high seas when the vessel is found in or brought to United States waters. The federal prosecutors in Honolulu worked in close coordination with the State Department and the South Korean government to ensure that the pursuit of justice did not spark a diplomatic crisis. The result was a trial that operated at the intersection of three different cultures and legal traditions, all focused on a single night of unimaginable slaughter. The prosecution's strategy was built on a foundation of undeniable physical evidence and the sheer, overwhelming brutality of the crime. They presented a narrative of cold, calculated, and premeditated mass murder. The lead prosecutor detailed the systematic way in which the mutineers had targeted the sleeping officers, emphasizing that this was not a spontaneous outburst of anger but a coordinated execution. To the government, the disposal of the bodies was the most damning evidence of a criminal mind. They argued that the act of dismembering the victims and feeding them to sharks demonstrated a level of depravity that superseded any claims of victimhood. The forensic experts took the stand to describe the blood spatter patterns and the DNA recovered from the meat cleavers and iron hooks, painting a vivid and terrifying picture for the jury. They aimed to convince the court that regardless of the conditions on board the ship, the response of the Vietnamese laborers was a disproportionate and monstrous act of violence that could not be justified under any civilized code of law. In stark contrast, the defense team, comprised of federal public defenders, faced the monumental task of humanizing men who had admitted to taking part in a massacre. Their strategy did not center on denying the killings, but on explaining the extreme psychological and physical conditions that made the violence seem like the only path to survival. They introduced the concept of the hell ship, a term used to describe vessels where the command structure had completely abandoned the rule of law in favor of a regime of terror. The defense brought in experts on maritime labor and psychological trauma to testify about the effects of prolonged starvation, sleep deprivation, and systemic physical abuse. They argued that the Vietnamese crew members were suffering from a collective state of temporary insanity or a profound survival reflex triggered by the South Korean officers' cruelty. By highlighting the iron pipes and the meager food rations, the defense sought to shift the moral weight of the tragedy back onto the victims, portraying the officers as the original aggressors who had essentially forced the laborers to become killers. One of the most emotional and pivotal moments of the trial occurred when the surviving Vietnamese crew members were called to testify. Through the steady, rhythmic cadence of interpreters, the court heard the first-hand accounts of the abuse that had preceded the mutiny. These men spoke of the crushing isolation of the Pacific, the way the horizon seemed to close in on them as they were beaten day after day. They described the physical pain of their injuries and the even deeper psychological pain of being treated as less than human. These testimonies provided a crucial counterpoint to the prosecution's forensic evidence, forcing the jury to confront the humanity of the defendants. The courtroom was often silent as these stories of suffering were told, the air heavy with the weight of two conflicting tragedies. The jurors had to weigh the horrific images of the dismembered bodies against the harrowing accounts of the men who felt they were being slowly worked and starved to death in the middle of the ocean. As the trial progressed, the focus intensified on Nguyen Van Chuck, the man identified as the primary leader of the uprising. Chuck's presence in the courtroom was one of stoic resignation. Unlike some of his co-defendants who appeared visibly shaken or broken, Chuck maintained a calm, almost detached demeanor. His testimony was a critical moment for the defense, as he explained the rationalization behind the decision to strike. He did not ask for mercy or attempt to hide the details of the slaughter. Instead, he presented the mutiny as a tactical necessity. He described the moment of decision as a point of no return, where the fear of the officers' iron pipes finally outweighed the fear of the law. His testimony reinforced the idea that the massacre was a calculated act of liberation, however bloody and horrific that liberation might have been. This presentation of the crime as a logical response to an illogical level of cruelty was the cornerstone of the defense's attempt to avoid the death penalty for their clients. The legal arguments also delved into the specific charges of piracy and murder on the high seas. The prosecution argued that the seizure of the vessel constituted an act of piracy, while the defense countered that the men had no interest in the ship or its cargo other than as a means to escape their abusers. This distinction was critical for sentencing, as piracy charges under federal law carry mandatory life sentences. The complexity of the case was further deepened by the testimony of the South Korean families who had traveled to Honolulu to represent the victims. These families brought a different kind of pain into the courtroom, the grief of wives and children who had lost their primary providers in a manner that was almost too gruesome to comprehend. Their presence served as a constant reminder that, for every story of abuse told by the defendants, there was a corresponding void left in a home in South Korea. The trial became a delicate balancing act of empathy, as the court was forced to navigate the suffering of two distinct groups caught in a cycle of maritime violence. After weeks of testimony, the jury was tasked with reaching a verdict that would somehow account for the immense complexity of the Detching to Zero to tragedy. The deliberations were long and difficult, reflecting the deep moral and legal questions that had been raised throughout the trial. When the verdicts were finally read, they reflected a middle ground that acknowledged both the severity of the crimes and the mitigating factors of the abuse. Nguyen Van Chuck and the other primary leaders of the mutiny were found guilty of multiple counts of murder and piracy. However, the extreme conditions of their servitude on the vessel were clearly taken into account during the sentencing phase. While the prosecution had initially pushed for the death penalty, the court ultimately opted for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the lead perpetrators. The remaining crew members, whose roles in the actual killings were less clear or who were found to have acted under extreme duress, received varying sentences of imprisonment, with some eventually being deported back to Vietnam after serving their time. The judge's final remarks before passing the sentences were a somber reflection on the failures of the international maritime system. The court noted that while the law must punish the act of murder, it cannot ignore the environment that breeds such violence. The sentencing of the Detching to Zero to mutineers was a definitive statement that even in the most remote corners of the ocean, the laws of the United States would be upheld. Yet, there was an underlying sense that the legal victory was a hollow one. 8 men were dead and their remains lost to the sea. and a group of young laborers would spend the rest of their lives in American prisons for a crime they believed was their only hope for survival. The results of the trial provided a clear legal resolution, but they offered little in the way of true closure for the deep systemic issues that had allowed the situation to escalate to such a horrific conclusion. The outcome in Honolulu echoed across the international maritime community, serving as a landmark case for how modern mutinies and human rights abuses at sea would be handled. The files of the Detching to Zero were closed, but the legal precedents established during the trial remained. It proved that the shield of a foreign flag was not an absolute protection against the scrutiny of the law when human life was at stake. For the survivors, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a long, quiet existence in the federal prison system, a world of concrete and steel that was perhaps even more isolating than the Pacific Ocean had been. They were no longer nameless laborers on a fishing boat. They were the faces of one of the most significant maritime criminal cases in history. The verdict ensured that they would never again have to endure the iron pipes of an abusive officer. But the cost of that safety was the permanent loss of their freedom and the eternal weight of the lives they had taken in the dark of the Pacific night. The physical presence of the Detching 200 did not simply vanish once the gavel fell in the Honolulu courtroom. Nor did the memories of its blood-stained decks dissipate like the tropical mist over the harbor of Pago Pago. For a long time, the vessel remained moored in the docks of American Samoa, a silent and rusted monument to a tragedy that the local community wished to forget. To the residents of Tutuila, the ship was a haunted object, a floating tomb that served as a grim reminder of the darkness that can seep into their peaceful waters from the unregulated depths of the high seas. Eventually, the ship was sold stripped of its history and likely dismantled for scrap metal or renamed and sent back into the service of the very industry that had birthed its horror. This cycle of reuse is a perfect metaphor for the maritime industry itself, where hulls are repainted and names are changed. But the underlying structures of exploitation and isolation often remain untouched by time or tragedy. The physical ship may have been erased from the registers, but the psychological and legal ripples of the massacre continued to expand. Touching lives in 3 different countries and leaving a permanent scar on the history of maritime labor. For the Vietnamese survivors who were sent to federal prisons across the United States, the conclusion of the trial was merely the beginning of a different kind of isolation. These men, many of whom were still in their youth when they were recruited from their coastal villages, found themselves thousands of miles away from their families, confined within concrete walls that were as impenetrable as the Pacific Ocean. In federal facilities like USP Florence or other high-security institutions, they became men without a country, living in a linguistic and cultural vacuum. The irony of their situation was profound. They had committed a horrific act of violence to escape the cage of a fishing vessel, only to find themselves in a more permanent and regulated cage. Their days were no longer dictated by the hauling of nets or the beatings of a captain, but by the rigid, mechanical schedule of the American penal system. They traded the unpredictability of the ocean for the absolute predictability of a prison cell, a transition that many of them struggled to reconcile with their past lives as simple fishermen. The psychological toll on these men remained a subject of study for years. The trauma of the abuse they suffered and the trauma of the crimes they committed were inextricably linked, creating a complex mental landscape where guilt and victimhood were constantly at war. Some of the men reportedly withdrew into a state of perpetual silence, much like the silence they had maintained on the ship before the uprising. They carried with them the images of the night in February 2001, the cold weight of the meat cleavers and the sound of the ocean swallowing the evidence of their deeds. In the quiet hours of the night in a federal penitentiary, it is likely that they were haunted by the faces of the South Korean officers, men who had been their tormentors but who were also, in the final analysis, human beings with families of their own. This internal conflict is the true, hidden cost of the Detching 200 massacre, a burden of memory that no legal sentence could ever fully mitigate or resolve. In South Korea, the families of the victims faced a different kind of purgatory. The absence of bodies to bury is a unique and agonizing form of grief, particularly in cultures where funeral rites and the honoring of ancestors are central to the process of mourning. Because the remains of the 8 men were scattered in the deep waters off American Samoa and consumed by the life of the sea, there were no graves for the wives to visit, no final resting places for the children to honor. The ocean became a vast, unmarked cemetery, a place that the families could only look toward with a sense of profound loss and lingering resentment. For these families, justice in a Honolulu courtroom felt like a cold and distant abstraction. No amount of prison time for the Vietnamese laborers could bring back the fathers and husbands who had sailed away with the promise of a paycheck and never returned. The economic impact was also devastating, as many of these families lost their primary breadwinners, falling into a cycle of poverty that was a direct consequence of the violence on the high seas. The diplomatic relationship between South Korea, Vietnam, and the United States was also strained by the case, as it forced a public examination of the dark underbelly of the global seafood industry. The Detching 202 was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a systemic crisis. It highlighted the dangers of the flags of convenience system and the lack of oversight on vessels that operate in international waters. In the years following the trial, various non-governmental organizations and human rights groups used the case as a rallying cry for better protections for maritime workers. They pointed to the starvation and physical abuse described by the Vietnamese crew as evidence that modern-day slavery was alive and well in the 21st century. However, despite the international outcry and the legal precedents set by the trial, the pace of reform has been agonizingly slow. The high seas remain a vast and difficult territory to police, and the economic pressures that drive the industry continue to create environments where human lives are valued less than the catch they bring to the surface. The case of the Detching 202 also left a lasting mark on the legal community in American Samoa and Hawaii. It challenged the traditional boundaries of jurisdiction and forced lawyers to navigate a labyrinth of international treaties and maritime laws. The transcripts of the trial serve as a critical resource for law students and scholars, a case study in how the United States can and should intervene when human rights are violated in its territorial waters. The attorneys who worked on the case, both for the prosecution and the defense, often spoke of it as one of the most challenging and emotionally draining experiences of their careers. They were forced to look into the abyss of human cruelty and try to find a sense of balance in a situation where every possible outcome seemed tragic. The trial was a reminder that the law is a blunt instrument, often incapable of capturing the full nuance of a human tragedy that was forged in the extreme conditions of isolation and despair. As we look back on the events of 2001, the story of the Detching 202 remains a chilling cautionary tale about the breaking point of the human spirit. It is a story that defies simple categorization. If we view the Vietnamese crew only as cold-blooded killers, we ignore the systematic torture and dehumanization that pushed them to the brink of insanity. If we view them only as victims, we ignore the absolute brutality of the massacre and the horrific desecration of the victims' bodies. The truth lies in the uncomfortable middle ground, in the realization that a human being can be both a victim of extreme cruelty and a perpetrator of unimaginable violence. The pressure cooker of the ship created a situation where morality was stripped away, leaving only the primal instinct to survive at any cost. This is the ultimate horror of the Detching 202. It shows us that under enough pressure, anyone can become a monster, and that the line between civilization and savagery is as thin and fragile as a ship's hull against the crushing weight of the ocean. Today, the waters off Pago Pago are once again quiet, the sun is still setting over the volcanic peaks of Tutuila with the same breathtaking beauty it possessed on the night of the mutiny. The tuna boats still come and go, their holds filled with the harvest of the Pacific, and the men who work on them still face the same isolation and the same demands for profit. The ocean has a way of absorbing trauma, of washing away the blood and the memory of violence, until only the rhythmic motion of the waves remains. But beneath the surface, the ghosts of the Detching 202 still linger. They are in the stories told by old sailors in the bars of American Samoa, in the legal archives of the Honolulu courthouse, and in the silent prayers of families in Vietnam and South Korea. They serve as a reminder that the deep sea is not just a resource to be exploited, but a place where our humanity is tested in its most raw and unforgiving form. The legacy of the Deching 202 is ultimately a call for empathy and a demand for visibility. It reminds us that the products we consume on land often come with a hidden human cost, a cost that is paid in sweat, blood, and sometimes in life itself. It forces us to acknowledge the men who work in the shadows of the global economy, the ones who are far from the protection of the law and the eyes of society. As we close the file on this dark chapter of maritime history, we must ask ourselves if we have truly learned the lessons of the Hell ship, or if we are simply waiting for the next pressure cooker to explode in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific. The story of the Deching 202 ends not with a sense of triumph or closure, but with a somber reflection on the vulnerability of the human soul. It is a story of a voyage that began with hope and ended in a nightmare, a journey that proved that the most dangerous thing on the open sea is not the storms or the sharks, but the darkness that we carry within ourselves, waiting for the right conditions to be unleashed. The Pacific Ocean remains as vast and as silent as ever, a deep blue mirror that reflects only what we bring to it. For the 8 men who lost their lives on that February night, the ocean is an eternal grave. For the men who took those lives, it is a haunting memory that can never be erased. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that justice is often a fragile and imperfect thing, a light that flickers but rarely illuminates the full depth of the human tragedy. The Deching 202 is gone, but the shadows of the criminal maritime world it exposed still drift across the horizon. A warning to any who would forget that even in the most beautiful and serene places on Earth, the capacity for horror is always just beneath the surface. The final word on this case belongs to the ocean itself, a word that is spoken in the constant, unyielding crash of the waves against the shore sound that is both a beginning and an end. A mourning and a forgetting, a testament to the enduring and terrifying silence of the deep. The vast and churning expanse of the Pacific Ocean possesses a unique and terrifying capacity for erasure, a characteristic that lies at the very heart of the tragedy of the Deching 202. Long after the federal court in Honolulu concluded its proceedings and the legal transcripts were archived in the vaults of American jurisprudence, the echoes of that February night continued to vibrate through the global maritime industry. To understand the final legacy of this case, one must look beyond the immediate violence and the subsequent prison sentences and instead examine the deep, structural silence that characterizes the world of high seas commercial fishing. The ocean is often described as the last wild frontier, a place where the reach of the law is thin and the visibility of human suffering is almost non-existent. In the 2 decades that have passed since the blood-soaked deck of the South Korean vessel was discovered off Pago Pago, the industry has undergone technological revolutions. Yet the fundamental vulnerability of the migrant laborer remains a haunting constant. The story of the Deching 202 serves as a permanent, chilling marker of what happens when a closed system of absolute authority meets the absolute desperation of men with nothing left to lose. The legal legacy of the case established a critical and somewhat controversial precedent regarding the expansion of United States maritime jurisdiction. By asserting the right to prosecute foreign nationals for crimes committed on a foreign-flagged vessel against foreign victims, the American legal system sent a definitive message to the global community. It declared that the isolation of the high seas was no longer an absolute shield against accountability. However, this legal victory brought with it a complex set of ethical dilemmas that continue to be debated in law schools and international forums. Critics often point out that while the United States was successful in punishing the mutineers, the system failed to address the root causes of their desperation. The trial focused on the act of murder, as it legally had to, but it struggled to provide a mechanism for prosecuting the systemic labor abuses that had preceded the violence. The iron pipes, the starvation, and the psychological torture were presented as mitigating factors for the defense, but they did not result in criminal charges against the corporate entities that owned and operated the Hell ship. This imbalance of justice remains a significant and troubling aspect of the case's final resolution. In the small, rural villages of central Vietnam from which the laborers were recruited, the tragedy left a vacuum of silence that was never truly filled. For the families of the men who were sent to American prisons, the dream of economic salvation turned into a multi-generational nightmare. The remittances that were supposed to build new homes and secure the education of children never arrived, replaced instead by the heavy, shameful stigma of a criminal conviction in a foreign land. These communities, often isolated from the complexities of international news, were left to piece together the fate of their sons and husbands through fragmented reports and the occasional, heavily monitored letter from a federal penitentiary. The absence of these men became a permanent feature of the village landscape, a reminder of the perilous nature of seeking a life beyond the horizon. The collective trauma of the Detching to Zero to effectively poison the well of maritime recruitment in those specific regions, serving as a grim cautionary tale passed down through whispered conversations around cooking fires. The South Korean maritime community also faced a period of profound soul-searching following the massacre. The loss of 8 experienced seamen in such a gruesome manner forced a momentary confrontation with the harsh realities of their own industrial culture. For a time, there were calls for increased safety measures and better oversight of multinational crews. But the relentless pressure of global seafood markets eventually pushed these concerns to the periphery. The officers of the Detching to Zero were remembered as martyrs of a dangerous trade. Their deaths used to justify even stricter control and surveillance on commercial vessels. The deep-seated cultural and nationalistic tensions that had contributed to the friction on board the ship were not resolved. Instead, they were often further entrenched. The tragedy did not lead to a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of the industry, but rather to a more cautious and paranoid approach to the management of foreign labor. The concept of the hell ship remains a recurring ghost in the modern world, manifesting in different oceans and under different flags, but always sharing the same DNA of isolation and abuse. The Detching to Zero was a concentrated, explosive version of a much wider phenomenon that persists today. Modern satellite tracking and electronic logging have made it harder for a ship to simply disappear, but they have done little to monitor the quality of human interactions within the hull. The psychological pressure of a 20-hour workday, the lack of medical care, and the complete dependency on a captain for food and water still create the same pressurized environment that existed in 2001. The tragedy off American Samoa was a catastrophic failure of this pressure vessel, a moment when the seams finally burst, but the vessel of the industry itself remains structurally the same, continuing to navigate the same dangerous moral waters. As the years passed, the physical evidence of the crime was reclaimed by the elements. The Detching to Zero, if it still exists in some form as a renamed trawler or a rusted hulk in a breaker's yard, carries no outward sign of the horror it once contained. The ocean has a remarkable ability to sanitize history, to wash away the blood and the memory of screams with the relentless application of salt and time. Yet, for those who look closely at the records, the case remains a vivid and disturbing portrait of human nature in extremis. It is a story that refuses to be neatly categorized into a narrative of good versus evil. Instead, it forces us to confront the terrifying reality that under the right conditions of suffering and isolation, the capacity for monstrous violence exists in everyone. The mutineers were not born as killers. They were forged into them by a system that had stripped away every other option for their continued existence. The final closing of the case files does not mean the end of the story, but rather its transition into the realm of myth and warning. In the bars of Pago Pago and the docks of Honolulu, the story of the Vietnamese mutiny on the South Korean ship is still told by veteran sailors, its details becoming more legendary with each retelling. It has become part of the dark folklore of the Pacific, a ghost story that is grounded in a very real and very bloody truth. The sharks that were once fed by the mutineers have long since moved onto other currents. But the image of that moonlit deck and the falling cleavers remains burned into the collective memory of the maritime world. It is a reminder that the sea does not just provide resources. It also reflects the depths of human depravity and the resilience of the instinct to survive. The ultimate reflection on the Detching to Zero must center on the invisibility of the victims on both sides of the tragedy. The South Korean officers were victims of a violent uprising. Their lives ended in a horrific and lonely manner far from the homes they were working to support. The Vietnamese laborers were victims of a systemic cruelty that began long before they ever picked up a weapon. Their humanity eroded by a global industry that viewed them as expendable. In the end, everyone who stepped onto that ship was a casualty of a maritime culture that operates in the shadows. The tragedy was not just the massacre itself, but the fact that it was entirely preventable. It was the result of 1,000 small decisions to ignore suffering, to prioritize profit over safety, and to treat the high seas as a lawless void where human rights do not apply. As the sun sets over the Pacific today, thousands of ships similar to the Detching to Zero are still out there, their lights flickering on the horizon like distant stars. Inside those hulls, the same dynamics of power and desperation are playing out in 1,000 different ways. The silence of the ocean remains as profound as it was in 2001, and the reach of the law remains as tenuous. The story of the massacre off American Samoa is a plea for us to look closer at those distant lights, to recognize the human lives that are tied to the products we consume, and to understand that the isolation of the sea is no longer an excuse for the abandonment of our shared moral responsibility. The case of the Detching to Zero was a rupture in the fabric of the world, a moment of terrible clarity that showed us exactly what we are capable of when we are left alone in the dark. The final thought for any listener of this narrative must be one of somber acknowledgement. We have followed the trail of the Detching to Zero from the recruitment offices of Vietnam to the brutal decks of the Pacific, through the gruesome disposal of bodies and the clinical environment of a federal courtroom. We have seen the faces of the killers and the ghosts of the victims. What remains is a profound sense of the fragility of the human condition. The tragedy is a testament to the fact that peace and order are not the natural states of our world, but are instead fragile constructs that must be actively maintained through empathy, oversight, and the rule of law. When those constructs are removed, as they were on the South Korean fishing vessel, we are left with the raw and terrifying reality of the human animal fighting for its life in an indifferent universe. The ocean continues its eternal cycle, unbothered by the histories of the ships that traverse its surface. The waves that once carried the remains of the South Korean officers have been replaced by new waves, and the air that once carried the scent of blood has been purified by the trade winds. But for those who remember the Detching to Zero, the Pacific will always hold a certain darkness. A reminder of the night when the world shook and a group of desperate men built a life and a death that could not be moved from the pages of history. The case remains a silent sentinel on the edge of our consciousness, a warning from the deep that the true cost of our world is often hidden beneath the waves, waiting for the light of justice to find it, or for the darkness of the sea to swallow it forever. The story ends here, but the questions it raises will continue to drift across the water, as long as men go down to the sea in ships and the hunger for profit outweighs the sanctity of human life. The Pacific is a beautiful, terrible, and ultimate witness to the secrets we try to bury in its depths, and the Detching to Zero is perhaps its most haunting secret of all. The passage of time has a curious way of smoothing over the jagged edges of even the most horrific tragedies. Yet the story of the Detching to Zero remains stubbornly lodged in the collective consciousness of those who understand the true nature of the high seas. To look back at the events of February 2001 from the vantage point of the present is to witness a moment where the invisible world of maritime labor was briefly ended, violently illuminated by a flash of unimaginable cruelty. For the men who survived that night, the transition from the chaotic, blood-soaked deck of a fishing vessel to the sterile, unyielding environment of the American federal prison system represented a final and absolute severance from the lives they had known in the coastal villages of Vietnam. They had set out into the Pacific as providers, driven by the humble ambition of securing a future for their families. But they ended their journey as historical figures in a landmark criminal case that redefined the boundaries of international law. The steel walls of their prison cells in the United States became the final destination of a voyage that was supposed to lead to economic salvation. A cruel irony that underscores the profound risks inherent in the global shadow economy. In the decades following the trial in Honolulu, the case of the Detching to Zero has been utilized as a primary case study in the evolving field of human rights at sea. Yet the reality for the men behind bars remained one of quiet and enduring isolation. For the lead perpetrators, the vastness of the Pacific Ocean was replaced by the confined geometry of a high-security facility, where the sounds of the waves were substituted by the mechanical clanging of steel doors and the distant hum of industrial air filtration. They existed in a linguistic and cultural vacuum, separated from their homeland by thousands of miles and a legal system that had processed their crimes but could never fully articulate their suffering. These men became ghosts within the American penal system, surviving on memories of the salt air and the rhythmic motion of the sea, while carrying the internal weight of the 8 lives they had systematically extinguished. Their existence was a testament to the fact that while the law can punish a crime, it often struggles to provide a path for the reconciliation of the soul, leaving the perpetrators and the victims alike trapped in a permanent state of unresolved trauma. The impact of the massacre on the territory of American Samoa also lingered long after the ship was removed from the harbor of Pago Pago. For the local community, the event shattered the illusion of the islands as a remote paradise immune to the violent complexities of the outside world. The harbor, which serves as a critical hub for the global tuna industry, was forced to confront the reality that the vessels docking at its piers were not just industrial machines but high-pressure environments where human dignity was frequently the first casualty. The local authorities and the residents of Tutuila became the unintentional custodians of a horrific maritime secret, a burden that changed the way they viewed the multinational fleets that fueled their economy. The story of the South Korean ship became a cautionary tale whispered in the shadow of Rainmaker Mountain, a reminder that the ocean brings with it both the bounty of the earth and the darkest manifestations of human desperation. The geographic isolation that once defined American Samoa was forever compromised by the realization that they were the primary witnesses to a crime that had no national boundaries. Looking deeper into the systemic failures that allowed the Detching to Zero to become a slaughterhouse, we find a global fishing industry that continues to operate with a level of opacity that would be unthinkable in any land-based sector. The reliance on migrant labor from developing nations creates a workforce that is inherently vulnerable, as these men often lack the legal protections or the communication tools necessary to report abuse. The officers on such vessels are often subjected to their own set of pressures, forced to meet impossible quotas by corporate entities that prioritize the bottom line over the safety of the crew. This creates a toxic hierarchy where frustration and stress are passed down from the top until they reach the lowest levels of the ship, manifesting as physical violence and systemic deprivation. The Detching to Zero was not an anomaly but a predictable outcome of a system designed to maximize extraction while minimizing the cost of human life. Until the international community addresses the fundamental lack of oversight on the high seas, the conditions that birthed the mutiny of 2001 will continue to persist in the hidden corners of our oceans. The families of the South Korean officers also remained caught in a cycle of grief that was amplified by the lack of physical remains to bury. In the cultural context of South Korea, the inability to perform traditional funeral rites for the dead creates a lingering sense of spiritual unrest and emotional incompletion. The 8 men who were murdered on the ship did not just lose their lives. They were denied a final resting place, their bodies discarded into the indifferent depths of the Pacific. For their wives and children, the ocean became a symbol of betrayal, a vast and silent thief that offered no closure and no possibility of a final goodbye. The economic consequences were equally severe, as the loss of a husband or a father often meant the loss of the family's stability and future. The trial in Hawaii provided a legal verdict, but it could not fill the void left in the homes of the victims. Nor could it provide an answer to the fundamental question of why their loved ones had to suffer such a gruesome and lonely end. In Vietnam, the ripples of the tragedy were felt in the quiet coastal communities, where the mutineers had once been celebrated as brave explorers of the new economy. The debt incurred to send these men to sea became a heavy burden for the families they left behind, a financial and social millstone that lasted for generations. The news of the massacre and the subsequent life sentences sent shockwaves through these villages, creating a climate of fear and suspicion regarding international labor contracts. The men who were once seen as the hope of their families were now the subjects of international shame. Their names associated with a level of violence that was foreign to the peaceful traditions of their ancestors. The story of the Detching to Zero became a hidden chapter in the history of these communities, a tragedy that was felt deeply but rarely spoken of in the presence of outsiders. The silence of the Pacific was mirrored in the silence of the families, as they navigated a world where their sons were neither dead nor truly alive, but lost in the labyrinth of a foreign justice system. The legal precedents established by the case continue to influence how maritime crimes are investigated and prosecuted today. The assertion of United States jurisdiction over the vessel proved that the high seas are not a lawless vacuum. But the case also highlighted the limitations of the law in the face of extreme human suffering. The federal judges and prosecutors who handled the case were forced to acknowledge that the perpetrators were themselves victims of a brutal regime, creating a moral complexity that the law was not entirely equipped to handle. The life sentences handed down to the leaders of the mutiny were a necessary affirmation of the sanctity of human life. Yet they also felt like a final act of containment for a problem that was much larger than a few desperate men on a fishing boat. The courtroom in Honolulu was a stage where the world attempted to impose order on a situation of absolute chaos. But the underlying tensions of the maritime industry remain largely unaddressed by the final verdict. As we reach the conclusion of this narrative, we are left to meditate on the nature of the sea itself as the ultimate and most indifferent witness to human history. The Pacific Ocean does not remember the blood that was spilled on the deck of the Detching 202, nor does it care about the legal arguments that were made in its name. The water is a vast and eternal force that simply absorbs the tragedies we bring to it, recycling the remnants of our violence into the rhythmic cycles of the deep. The story of the massacre remains with us not because the ocean remembers, but because we are the ones who must carry the memory of the dead. We are the ones who must look at the horizon and recognize that the beauty of the natural world is often a mask for the darkest aspects of the human experience. The Detching 202 is a ghost ship that will always sail through the annals of true crime, a reminder of the fragility of civilization when it is pushed to the absolute edge of the world. The final image of this tragedy is one of profound and heavy silence. It is the silence of the officers' quarters after the violence had ceased, the silence of the Vietnamese laborers as they stood on the deck under the moonlight, and the silence of the court files as they are tucked away in the archives. It is a silence that speaks of the absolute failure of human empathy and the devastating consequences of isolation. The story of the Detching 202 is a journey into the heart of darkness, a descent into a place where the rules of society are stripped away and replaced by a primal struggle for survival. It is a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the surface of the things we consume and to recognize the human cost of the world we have built. The men who sailed on that ship, both the murdered and the murderers, are forever bound together in a tragic and inseparable knot, a testament to the fact that on the open sea, we are all ultimately responsible for the humanity of those around us. The legacy of the Detching 202 is a permanent stain on the history of international maritime labor. A haunting echo of a night when the world of the high seas was torn apart by a desperate and bloody rebellion. It is a story that ends not with a sense of peace, but with a somber awareness of the capacity for horror that exists within the human spirit when it is abandoned in the vastness of the deep. The ocean remains as it has always been, majestic, unforgiving, and silent, while we are left to ponder the lessons of a ship that became a slaughterhouse and a legal case that became a window into the soul of a global industry. The voyage of the Detching 202 is finally over, but the questions it raised will continue to drift across the Pacific. As long as men seek their fortunes in the dangerous waters of the deep and the human heart continues to struggle with the twin forces of desperation and rage. The story is a monument to the victims, a warning to the industry, and a deep, chilling meditation on the true cost of survival in a world that often refuses to see the suffering of those who labor in the shadows of the horizon. The passage of more than 2 decades since the blood-soaked deck of the Detching 20 was discovered drifting in the Pacific has not dulled the sharp, terrifying edges of its legacy. To truly grasp the finality of this tragedy, we must look beyond the immediate violence and the clinical atmosphere of the Honolulu courtroom and peer into the long, dark shadow that this single vessel cast over the history of international maritime labor. The ocean is often described as a place without memory, a vast blue void that swallows secrets and sanitizes history with the relentless application of salt and time. Yet, for those whose lives were forever altered by the events of February 17, 2001, the Pacific remains a haunted geography. The story of the South Korean fishing vessel is more than a simple sequence of crime and punishment. It is a profound and disturbing examination of the limits of human endurance and the catastrophic consequences that occur when those limits are pushed beyond the point of no return. As we move into this final phase of our investigation, we must confront the enduring psychological and structural echoes of a massacre that was born from the darkest depths of the human experience. The psychological weight of the Detching 20 massacre did not end with the sentencing of the mutineers. Instead, it transformed into a permanent and heavy silence that followed the Vietnamese survivors into the American federal prison system. For men like Nguyen Van Chek, the transition from the desperate, high-pressure environment of a hell ship to the rigid, concrete geometry of a high-security penitentiary represented a final and absolute severance from the world they had known. These men, who had originally left their small coastal villages with the humble hope of providing for their families, found themselves trapped in a linguistic and cultural vacuum. In the eyes of the American legal system, they were perpetrators of an unspeakable crime, but in their own minds, they remained survivors of a systemic cruelty that the world had largely ignored. This internal conflict, the dual identity of victim and executioner, created a unique form of psychological torment that no legal verdict could ever fully resolve. They spent their days in quiet reflection, carrying the internal weight of the lives they had taken and the horrific memories of the iron pipes that had driven them to such an explosive and irreversible response. The families of the South Korean officers in cities like Bisan and Incheon were left to navigate a different kind of void. In the traditional Korean context, the lack of physical remains to perform ancestral rites is a source of profound spiritual distress and social stigma. The 8 men who were murdered on the ship did not just disappear. They were systematically erased, their bodies cast into the shark-infested waters of the Pacific to ensure they would never be found. For their wives and children, the ocean became an eternal and unmarked grave, a vast thief that offered no closure and no possibility of a final goodbye. The economic devastation of losing a primary breadwinner was compounded by the psychological trauma of knowing how their loved ones had suffered in their final moments. The trial in Honolulu provided a sense of legal justice, but it could not provide the spiritual peace that comes with a burial. The families remained caught in a state of perpetual mourning, looking toward the horizon with a mixture of grief and a deep, unyielding resentment toward a system that had allowed such a tragedy to unfold in the shadows of the law. The territory of American Samoa also bears the invisible scars of the Detching 20 incident. The harbor of Pago Pago, once seen as a tranquil and strategic hub for the global tuna industry, was forever changed by the discovery of the drifting ghost ship. The local community, known for its deep connection to the sea and its strong cultural traditions of hospitality, was forced to confront the dark reality of the industrial fleets that fueled their economy. The story of the massacre became a cautionary tale whispered in the shadow of the lush, volcanic mountains, a reminder that the ocean brings with it not only the bounty of the earth, but also the most violent manifestations of human desperation. The geographic isolation that had long defined the islands was compromised by the realization that they were the primary witnesses to a crime that had no national boundaries. The rusted hull of the South Korean vessel sat in their harbor for a long time, a silent and terrifying monument that served as a constant reminder of the thin line between civilization and savagery in the middle of the deep. Looking deeper into the structural failures revealed by the case, we find a global maritime industry that continues to struggle with the same issues of opacity and exploitation that birthed the mutiny. The reliance on migrant labor from developing nations like Vietnam and Indonesia creates a workforce that is structurally vulnerable, as these men often lack the language skills or the legal protections to report abuse. The officers on these vessels are themselves subjected to immense pressure from corporate owners who prioritize profit over the preservation of human life. This creates a toxic hierarchy where stress and frustration are passed down until they manifest as physical violence at the lowest levels of the ship. The Detching to Zero was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome of a system that treats human beings as expendable commodities. Despite the international outcry and the legal precedents established by the trial, the pace of reform in the deep-sea fishing industry has remained agonizingly slow, leaving thousands of other laborers in the same high-pressure environments that led to the explosion of 2001. The legal precedents of the case remain a significant point of study for maritime scholars and human rights advocates. The assertion of United States jurisdiction over a foreign flag ship on the high seas was a bold statement that accountability could reach into the most remote corners of the planet. Yet, the trial also highlighted the inherent limitations of the law in addressing systemic issues. The federal court was able to punish the act of murder, but it could not prosecute the corporate negligence or the cultural isolation that created the conditions for the crime. The sentencing of Nguyen Vinh Chuc and his co-defendants to life imprisonment was a necessary affirmation of the rule of law, but it also felt like a final act of containment for a problem that was much larger than the men on the boat. The courtroom in Honolulu was a place where the world attempted to impose order on a situation of absolute chaos. But the underlying tensions of the maritime labor market remained largely unaddressed by the final verdict, leaving a sense of incompletion that lingers to this day. As we conclude this narrative, we are left to meditate on the nature of the Pacific Ocean as the ultimate and most indifferent witness to human history. The water does not remember the blood that was spilled on the deck of the South Korean vessel, nor does it care about the legal arguments that were made in its name. It is a vast and eternal force that simply absorbs the tragedies we bring to it, recycling the remnants of our violence into the rhythmic cycles of the deep. The story of the Detching to Zero remains with us not because the ocean remembers, but because we are the ones who must carry the memory of the dead. We are the ones who must look at the horizon and recognize that the beauty of the natural world is often a mask for the darkest aspects of the human experience. The ship is gone, the men are imprisoned or lost to the sea, and the files are tucked away in the archives. But the questions raised by the massacre continue to drift across the water, waiting for a time when the human cost of our global industries is finally given the visibility it deserves. The final image of this tragedy is one of profound and heavy silence. It is the silence of the officers' quarters after the violence had ceased, the silence of the Vietnamese laborers as they stood on the deck under the moonlight, and the silence of the families in Korea and Vietnam who are left with only questions. It is a silence that speaks of the absolute failure of human empathy and the devastating consequences of isolation. The story of the Detching to Zero is a journey into the heart of darkness, a descent into a place where the rules of society are stripped away and replaced by a primal struggle for survival. It is a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the surface of the things we consume and to recognize the human lives that are tied to the products of the sea. The men who sailed on that ship are forever bound together in a tragic and inseparable knot, a testament to the fact that on the open ocean, we are all ultimately responsible for the humanity of those around us. The legacy of the Detching to Zero is a permanent stain on the history of international maritime labor. A haunting echo of a night when the world of the high seas was torn apart by a desperate and bloody rebellion. It is a story that ends not with a sense of peace, but with a somber awareness of the capacity for horror that exists within the human spirit when it is abandoned in the vastness of the deep. The ocean remains as it has always been, majestic, unforgiving, and silent, while we are left to ponder the lessons of a ship that became a slaughterhouse and a legal case that became a window into the soul of a global industry. The voyage of the Detching to Zero is finally over. But the shadows it casts will continue to influence the way we view the sea and the men who work upon it for generations to come. It is a deep, chilling meditation on the true cost of survival and the eternal, unspoken secrets that lie beneath the waves of the Pacific. The conclusion of a story as harrowing as the massacre on the Detching-2-0 does not arrive with the closing of a courtroom door or the final signature on a legal decree. Instead, it lingers in the atmosphere of the high seas like a persistent, chilling fog that refuses to lift even under the brightest tropical sun. As we reach the final movement of this narrative, we must move beyond the immediate blood and the clinical reach of the law to examine the permanent, invisible residues left behind by such an explosive rupture of human order. The ocean is often described as an entity that forgets, a vast and churning machine that recycles tragedy into the rhythmic indifference of the tides. However, for those whose names were etched into the ledgers of this case, the Pacific became something much more sinister, a witness that cannot speak and a grave that will never be marked. The Detching-2-0 is no longer a physical vessel navigating the waters of American Samoa, but it remains a ghost ship in the annals of maritime history. A reminder that the thin veneer of civilization can be stripped away entirely when the weight of isolation and abuse becomes too heavy for the human spirit to bear. In the federal prisons of the United States, thousands of miles from the salt spray of the South Pacific and the quiet villages of Vietnam, the surviving mutineers have spent decades navigating a different kind of silence. The transition from the chaotic, high-pressure environment of the hell ship to the rigid, sensory-deprived geometry of a high-security penitentiary represents the final stage of their journey into the unknown. These men, who once believed that violence was the only key to their liberation, found themselves trapped in a different kind of purgatory. In prison, the language barrier and the cultural distance create a profound internal isolation that mirrors the external isolation they faced on the open sea. They are no longer the desperate laborers who wielded meat cleavers in a frenzy of survival. They are aging men in jumpsuits, known by numbers rather than names, living out the consequences of a decision made in a moment of absolute psychological collapse. Their existence is a somber meditation on the cost of freedom, proving that even when one escapes the iron pipes of an abusive master, the shadow of the act itself becomes a new and permanent captor. The families in South Korea continue to live in the unresolved wake of the massacre, navigating a landscape of grief that has no physical center. In the cultural fabric of Korea, the importance of burial and the honoring of remains is central to the continuity of the family and the peace of the departed. Because the victims of the Detching-2-0 were systematically erased from the world, their bodies cast into the shark-infested depths and consumed by the ocean, the families were denied the fundamental human right to say goodbye. This lack of closure has created a multi-generational trauma, a sense that the spirits of the fathers, husbands, and sons are still drifting, lost in the indifferent currents of the Pacific. The legal justice achieved in Honolulu could never replace the spiritual void left by the absence of a grave. The families are left to perform memorial rites toward the horizon, their prayers disappearing into the same vast expanse that swallowed their loved ones. A tragic and eternal dialogue with a sea that offers no answers and no comfort. Beyond the personal tragedies, the case of the Detching-2-0 stands as a stark indictment of the global maritime industry, a system that in many ways has remained largely unchanged since that night in February 2001. The blue economy that fuels our global consumption continues to rely on a workforce that is hidden from view, operating in a jurisdictional void where the protections of the mainland are often non-existent. The structural issues that birthed the mutiny, the extreme isolation, the lack of oversight, the brutal quotas, and the dehumanization of migrant workers persist in the modern era. The tragedy was a warning that the international community largely failed to heed. While there have been improvements in satellite tracking and international labor conventions, the reality on the deck of a deep-sea fishing vessel remains one of extreme vulnerability. The pressure cooker that exploded off the coast of American Samoa is still being heated in other corners of the globe, fueled by the same economic desperation and the same unchecked authority that turned the Detching-2-0 into a slaughterhouse. The territory of American Samoa itself remains an unintentional guardian of this dark history. The port of Pago Pago, with its deep-water harbor and bustling tuna canneries, is a place where the world's oceans converge, bringing with them both the wealth of the sea and its hidden horrors. The story of the South Korean ship is now part of the local lore, a ghost story told by longshoremen and sailors that serves as a reminder of the fragility of the peace they enjoy. The lush, volcanic landscape and the serene beauty of the island stand in permanent, chilling contrast to the violence that once drifted just off their shores. The geographic position of American Samoa as a crossroads of the Pacific ensures that it will always be a witness to the complexities of maritime life. But the memory of the massacre remains a particularly deep scar, a moment when the darkness of the high seas stepped onto their pristine beaches and demanded to be seen. As we reflect on the legal proceedings that define the aftermath, we are forced to acknowledge the limitations of the law when faced with the absolute breakdown of human empathy. The United States federal court system processed the crimes with a clinical precision, weighing evidence and applying statutes to ensure that a verdict was reached. However, the courtroom could never truly capture the visceral terror of the night or the long, slow erosion of the soul that preceded it. The law can punish the hand that holds the weapon, but it struggles to reach the systemic failures that put the weapon there in the first place. The sentencing of the Vietnamese crew was a necessary act of social order, yet it remains a hollow victory in a case where everyone involved was, in some capacity, a victim of a monstrous system. The files of the Detching to Zero Two are closed, but the moral questions they raise remain open, drifting like the ship itself toward an uncertain and unforgiving future. The ultimate witness to this entire tragedy is the Pacific Ocean, an entity that is both the stage for the horror and the agent of its erasure. The water is a perfect and indifferent medium, capable of absorbing the greatest crimes of humanity and continuing its eternal, rhythmic cycles without a trace of guilt or memory. The waves that once carried the scent of blood and the sounds of screams have long since been replaced by new water. Yet the essence of the tragedy remains submerged in the collective consciousness of the maritime world. The ocean reminds us that we are all, in the end, small and vulnerable against the forces of nature and the darkness within our own hearts. The story of the Detching 202 is a journey to the very edge of the human experience, a place where the laws of society dissolve into the primal struggle for survival, and where the line between the innocent and the guilty is blurred by the sheer magnitude of suffering. The legacy of the massacre is a call for us to look closer at the horizons of our world and to recognize the human lives that are tied to the things we take for granted. Every product of the sea comes with a history, and for some, that history is written in the blood of those who labor in total isolation. The Detching 202 was a rupture in the fabric of the global economy, a moment of terrible clarity that forced us to look at what happens when we abandon human beings to the absolute authority of the deep. It is a story that demands our empathy not just for the victims of the violence, but for the survivors who were pushed into the role of killers by a world that refused to see them. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the waters where the ship once drifted, we are left with a profound sense of the fragility of our shared humanity. In the final analysis, the story of the Detching 202 is a narrative of absolute loss. There were no winners in this tragedy, only a trail of broken lives and haunted memories that span continents and decades. The South Korean officers are gone. There remains part of the deep-sea ecosystem. The Vietnamese mutineers are aging in prison, their youth and their dreams sacrificed to a moment of violent liberation. The families are left with a grief that has no anchor, and the industry continues its march toward profit with only a cursory glance at the ghosts it leaves behind. The silence of the Pacific is the final word on the matter, a heavy and unyielding quiet that underscores the insignificance of our legal verdicts and our industrial goals in the face of the ultimate and terrifying reality of the human condition. We tell these stories not to lang a man ho the violence or to satisfy a morbid curiosity, but to ensure that the silence of the ocean does not become absolute. By speaking the names of the dead and detailing the suffering of the living, we keep a light burning on the horizon of a world that is all too comfortable with darkness. The Detching 202 is a permanent part of our true crime history because it forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truths about ourselves, our capacity for cruelty, our instinct for survival, and our profound vulnerability when we are removed from the gaze of our fellow man. The voyage of the ship is over, but its message remains adrift, a warning from the deep that the true cost of our world is often hidden in the places we refuse to look, and that the ocean will always be a mirror that reflects the very best and the very worst of who we are. The final image of this series is one of the Pacific at night, a vast and shimmering expanse under a cold moon, where the only sound is the rhythmic crash of waves against a rusted hull that no longer exists. The air is clear, the water is deep, and the secrets of the Detching 202 are held in a silence that is as eternal as the sea itself. We leave this story here in the dark and quiet waters of American Samoa with a renewed understanding of the darkness that can consume the human soul and the light of justice that, however imperfectly, tries to find its way through the fog. The history of the high seas is a history of ghosts, and the Detching 202 is perhaps the most haunting ghost of all, a silent sentinel on the edge of the world, reminding us of the night the world shook and the ocean became a witness to the unimaginable. The final echoes of the Detching 202 do not resonate in the loud clanging of a prison gate or the decisive strike of a judge's gavel, but rather in the heavy and absolute silence that blankets the Pacific Ocean long after the sun has set below the horizon. When we look back at the harrowing sequence of events that began in the cramped and abusive quarters of a South Korean fishing vessel and ended in the federal courtrooms of Honolulu, we are forced to confront a reality that is as deep and as dark as the waters off the coast of American Samoa. This was never just a simple case of criminal intent or a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was the catastrophic failure of a global system that operates in the shadows of the modern world. The ocean, in its vast and terrifying indifference, served as both the catalyst for the tragedy and the ultimate witness to its conclusion. It provided the isolation necessary for the officers to transform into tyrants and the laborers to transform into killers. And then it swallowed the evidence of their mutual destruction with a cold and rhythmic efficiency that defies human comprehension. As we reach the conclusion of this long and difficult journey, we must ask ourselves what remains when the blood has been washed from the decks and the legal files have been tucked away in the archives of history. The legacy of the Detching 202 is perhaps most visible in the way it fundamentally altered the legal landscape of the high seas, proving that no vessel is truly beyond the reach of justice, no matter how remote the coordinates or how complex the jurisdictional web. The assertion of special maritime and territorial jurisdiction by the United States was a watershed moment that sent a clear signal to the international fishing industry. It established that the shield of a foreign flag and the anonymity of the deep ocean would no longer provide absolute immunity for those who violate the fundamental rights of their fellow man. However, this legal victory is a hollow one when measured against the human cost of the massacre. While the law successfully punished the mutineers for their horrific actions, it struggled to address the systemic rot that allowed a hell ship to exist in the first place. The trial in Honolulu was a masterclass in forensic precision and legal procedure, but it could not provide a remedy for the poverty, the isolation, and the unchecked authority that turned commercial vessels into floating pressure cookers of human desperation. For the men who spent their youth on the deck of the Detching 202 and will now spend the remainder of their lives in the federal prisons of the United States, the concept of justice is likely a confusing and distant abstraction. They are no longer the desperate rebels who fought for their lives with meat cleavers and iron hooks. They are aging men who exist in a state of permanent displacement, separated from their families by thousands of miles of water and a language they can barely speak. Their story is a tragic cycle of modern slavery followed by absolute incarceration, a journey from one cage to another without ever finding the freedom they so violently sought. In the quiet hours of their confinement, they must live with the haunting memories of the 8 men they butchered and the realization that their act of liberation resulted in a lifelong exile. They are the living ghosts of the Pacific, reminders of a night when the world of the high seas collapsed into a primal struggle for survival that left no one truly victorious. In the coastal villages of Vietnam and the port cities of South Korea, the absence of the men who sailed on the Deching to Zero to remains a profound and aching void that time has failed to heal. For the Korean families, the ocean is not a source of bounty but a vast and unmarked cemetery that holds the remains of their husbands and fathers in its cold, shark-infested depths. The lack of a physical grave to visit or remains to bury is a unique form of torture, a spiritual incompletion that prevents the living from ever truly moving forward. For the Vietnamese families, the tragedy is one of economic and social ruin, a dream of prosperity that turned into a legacy of shame and debt. These two groups of people, separated by nationality and language, are bound together by a shared history of maritime violence that has left them both as casualties of an industry that treats human beings as expendable tools of extraction. Their grief is the silent undercurrent of this entire story, a reminder that the true cost of our global industries is often paid by those who are the least equipped to bear it. The territory of American Samoa continues to guard the memory of the drifting ghost ship, its lush volcanic peaks standing in silent contrast to the dark events that unfolded in its territorial waters. The port of Pago Pago remains a vital node in the global tuna trade, a place where hundreds of vessels still dock every year, each one a potential microcosm of the same tensions that ignited the Deching 202. The story of the massacre has become part of the island's oral history, a cautionary tale that underscores the fragility of order in the face of extreme isolation. To the people of Tutuila, the ship was a reminder that even in a place of such breathtaking beauty, the capacity for human horror is always just beneath the surface. The ocean that surrounds them is a source of life and identity, but it is also a powerful reminder of the secrets that can be kept in the deep. Secrets that occasionally float back to the surface to demand the world's attention. Looking forward, the case of the Deching 202 serves as a stark and urgent warning for a maritime industry that still operates largely in the shadows. The structural issues of human rights at sea, the lack of communication, the physical abuse, the starvation, and the absolute power of the captain are not relics of the past but ongoing realities for thousands of migrant workers today. The tragedy was a predictable outcome of a system that prioritizes the harvest over the harvester, creating environments where violence becomes a logical, if horrific, response to a lack of agency. As long as the high seas remain a lawless frontier for labor exploitation, the potential for another Deching 202 remains ever present. The international community must move beyond the reactive punishment of individuals and toward the proactive oversight of the entire industry, ensuring that the isolation of the sea is never again used as a weapon against the vulnerable. The psychological transformation of the crew members from simple laborers into mass murderers is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire narrative. It forces us to acknowledge the thin and fragile line that separates civilization from savagery. When human beings are stripped of their dignity, denied their basic needs, and subjected to systemic physical pain, the moral codes of the mainland begin to dissolve. In the pressurized environment of the ship, the instinct for survival superseded every other human consideration, leading to an explosion of violence that was as inevitable as it was monstrous. This realization does not excuse the horrific nature of the massacre, but it provides a necessary and chilling context. It reminds us that we are all, in the end, products of our environment, and that when we allow such environments to exist, we are complicit in the horrors they produce. The mutineers were monsters of our own making, forged in the heat of an industry that refuses to see the humanity of its workers. The ocean remains the ultimate protagonist of this story, a vast and indifferent force that has reclaimed the physical remains of the tragedy while keeping the memory of it alive in the hearts of those who remember. The Pacific does not judge the men who died or the men who killed. It simply continues its eternal and rhythmic motion, unbothered by the human dramas that play out on its surface. It is a mirror that reflects the very best and the very worst of our species, showing us our capacity for endurance and our capacity for cruelty in equal measure. The story of the Deching 202 is a journey into the heart of that darkness, a descent into a world where the rules are rewritten by desperation and the horizon offers no hope. It is a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the convenience of our global markets and to recognize the human faces that are hidden behind the statistics of the catch. As we close the final chapter of this investigation, we are left with a profound sense of the weight of history. The Detching 202 is gone, its rusted hull likely dismantled and its name removed from the registers, but the questions it raised remain as urgent as ever. We are left to ponder the nature of justice, the cost of survival, and the responsibilities we have to one another in the most remote corners of our planet. The silence that now covers the waters off American Samoa is a heavy and expectant quiet, a reminder that the ocean still holds its secrets and that the darkness of the high seas is never truly banished. The story of the massacre is a monument to the victims, a warning to the industry, and the deep, chilling meditation on the true cost of a world that often refuses to see the suffering of those who labor in its shadows. We leave the story of the Detching 20 to where it began, in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The waves continue to crash against the volcanic shores of Pago Pago, and the fishing boats continue to set out into the deep blue in search of their harvest. The sun rises and sets with an unyielding predictability, and the world moves on, as it always does, after even the most horrific of tragedies. But for those who have listened to this narrative, the ocean will never look quite the same again. It will always hold the ghost of a South Korean ship and the shadows of a night when human nature was pushed to its absolute limit. The massacre was a rupture in the world that can never be fully repaired, a moment of terrible clarity that showed us exactly what we are capable of when we are left alone in the dark. The final word belongs to the sea, a deep and unyielding silence that underscores the insignificance of our legal verdicts and our industrial goals in the face of the ultimate and terrifying reality of the human condition. The voyage is over, the story is told, and the ghosts of the Detching 202 are finally allowed to rest in the deep, cold embrace of the Pacific.